There is a quiet contradiction in the body you live in. A small cut takes longer to close than it once did. A bruise lingers. Fatigue stays a little deeper, a little longer, even when nothing seems severely wrong. And yet, the human body was not always this way. For most of its history, it had to endure cold, hunger, distance, and injury without the comfort of rest or certainty. Survival did not allow for slow recovery. Something, somewhere along the long path from the Ice Age to now, shifted. Not suddenly, not completely, but enough that the body you have today carries a different rhythm of repair. A slower one, not broken but altered. Not weaker in every sense, but no longer tuned to the same demands. And if that is true, then the feeling of not recovering as quickly as expected may not be a flaw, but a trace of history still moving through you. So what changed between then and now? And why did humans become slower to recover after the Ice Age? A small cut on your skin closes, but not as quickly as you expect. There is no urgency in the way the body moves through the process. The edges remain visible for longer than they seem like they should. A bruise darkens, then fades slowly, sometimes staying for days in a quiet, stubborn way. Even a simple feeling of fatigue can linger, stretching into hours or days without a clear reason. None of this feels dramatic. Nothing feels broken, but there is a subtle delay, a softness in the timing, as if the body is no longer in a hurry to return to its original state. This experience is so familiar that it often passes without question. It is accepted as normal, as part of how the body works. And yet, when you pause and look closely, the slowness itself begins to feel unusual, not in comparison to other people, but in comparison to what the body might once have needed to do. Because there was a time when a slow recovery was not simply inconvenient, it was dangerous. The body you live in today carries systems shaped across a very long span of time, most of it far removed from the environment you now inhabit. For most of human history, there were no stable shelters, no predictable sources of food, no extended periods of rest without risk. Movement was constant, exposure was unavoidable, and the boundary between injury and survival was often narrow. In such a setting, a wound could not remain open for long. Weakness could not last. Fatigue could not accumulate without consequence. Recovery, in that context, was not a passive process. It had to happen with enough speed to allow the body to return to action before the environment demanded more from it, and the environment always demanded more. If the body failed to close a wound in time, infection could follow. If strength did not return quickly, the ability to move, to gather, or to escape could be compromised. There was little margin for delay. This does not mean that the human body was immune to injury, or that recovery was ever perfect. It simply suggests that the pace of recovery had to align closely with the pressures of the world outside the body. The rhythm of healing was not independent. It was tied to cold air, uneven ground, limited resources, and the presence of constant uncertainty. Over time, that rhythm may have shifted, not because the body forgot how to heal, but because the conditions that once shaped its urgency began to change. When you notice that a minor injury lingers, or that your energy returns more slowly than expected, it may not be a failure of the body. It may be a reflection of a different set of conditions, a different pace of life, one that no longer forces the body into the same patterns it once followed. The slowness is quiet, almost unremarkable, but it carries a long history within it, a history in which time, environment, and survival were closely linked, and where the body moved differently because it had to. This is not a story of decline, and not a simple contrast between strong and weak. It is a shift in timing, in priority, in the way the body allocates its resources across moments that no longer resemble those of the distant past. And if the body no longer rushes to recover in the way it once might have, the question is not only what has been lost, but also what has changed around it to make that loss possible, and even sustainable over time. If you follow that quiet delay a little further, it begins to feel less like a flaw and more like a pattern that repeats in small, almost invisible ways across the body. A sore muscle does not fully disappear overnight. A night of poor sleep lingers into the next day, and sometimes the day after. Even a minor illness can leave behind a trace of heaviness that stays longer than expected. None of these signals are strong on their own, but together they form a consistent rhythm, one in which recovery unfolds gradually, without urgency. It is a rhythm that feels normal now, but it does not necessarily reflect the conditions in which the human body first developed its basic responses to damage and strain. Long before controlled environments and predictable routines, the body existed in settings where each moment of weakness had a direct connection to the surrounding landscape. Cold air could slow movement, uneven ground could increase the risk of falling. Limited food meant that energy spent on healing had to be carefully balanced with energy needed for movement and awareness. In such conditions, the difference between recovering sooner or later was not simply a matter of comfort. It could influence whether the body remained capable of meeting the next demand placed upon it. This does not suggest that early humans experienced a constant state of rapid healing, but rather that the pressure to regain function quickly was always present in the background, shaping how the body allocated its resources. The systems responsible for repair, closing a wound, restoring strength, stabilizing internal balance did not operate in isolation. They were part of a broader interaction with an environment that offered little room for delay. When the body lost heat, it needed to restore balance quickly. When it lost strength, it needed to regain enough stability to continue moving. Recovery was not a separate phase that came after activity. It was woven into the continuous flow of movement, exposure, and response. Over long periods of time, this integration created a pattern in which healing processes were closely tied to immediate survival. The body could not afford to postpone repair until conditions were ideal, because conditions were rarely ideal. Instead, it adjusted constantly, repairing while still being used, recovering while still being exposed. When you compare that pattern to the present, a subtle difference emerges. The body is now often allowed to pause. It can remain still for extended periods. It can recover without immediate external pressure. At first glance, this might seem like an advantage, and in many ways it is, but it also changes the context in which recovery takes place. Without the same urgency imposed by the environment, the timing of repair is no longer forced into a narrow window. It can stretch. It can slow. The systems themselves have not disappeared, but the conditions that once shaped their pace have shifted. This does not mean that modern life has reduced the body's ability to heal in a direct or simple way. Rather, it suggests that healing is now happening within a different framework, one where the connection between immediate survival and rapid recovery is less direct. The body still responds to damage, still repairs itself, but it does so within a landscape that allows more variation in timing. That variation is what you feel as slowness. Not an absence of function, but a change in how quickly that function is required to return. And because this change is gradual, spread across generations and environments, it is difficult to notice as a single transformation. It appears instead as a quiet background condition, something that feels inherent to the body itself rather than shaped by the world around it. Yet when you place it against the long history of human adaptation, the pattern becomes clearer. The body you live in is not only responding to the present moment, it is also carrying forward systems that were once calibrated under very different pressures. And when those pressures change, even slightly, the timing of those systems can change with them, leaving behind subtle traces that are easy to overlook, but difficult to ignore once they are seen. There is another detail that often goes unnoticed, not in the body itself, but in the way the body is allowed to respond to strain. When something begins to hurt, the immediate reaction now is often to stop, to rest, to wait for the sensation to pass before continuing. This response feels natural, even careful, as if it protects the body from further damage. And in many situations it does. But if you imagine a setting where stopping is not always possible, the meaning of that signal begins to shift. In a colder and less predictable environment, where movement was closely tied to safety and access to resources, a sensation of discomfort could not always lead to stillness. The body had to continue in some form, even while adjusting, even while repairing. This does not mean ignoring pain, but rather responding to it within motion, not outside of it. Over long periods of time, this difference becomes significant. When recovery happens alongside continued activity, the body organizes its processes in a way that balances repair with function. It does not separate the two into distinct phases as clearly as it often does now. A joint might be under strain, yet still required to carry weight. Muscles might be fatigued, yet still needed for movement across uneven ground. In such conditions, the body develops a tolerance for operating within partial recovery, not waiting for a complete return to an earlier state before resuming use. This does not necessarily make recovery faster in every case, but it changes how recovery is experienced and how it unfolds over time. In contrast, when the body is frequently given the option to pause completely, recovery can become more segmented. There is activity, and then there is rest. There is strain, and then there is repair. This separation introduces a different rhythm, one that allows healing to extend over longer periods because the immediate pressure to restore full function is reduced. The body can afford to take more time because the environment no longer requires immediate readiness in the same way. This shift is subtle, and it does not apply equally to every situation, but it shapes the overall pattern in which recovery is perceived. It is not only about biological capacity, but about the context in which that capacity is used. The signals that guide behavior, fatigue, discomfort, weakness are still present, but the responses they produce are different. Where once they may have led to adjusted movement, they now more often lead to stillness. And stillness, while beneficial in many ways, also changes the timeline of recovery. It allows processes to unfold without interruption, but also without the constraints that once kept them closely tied to immediate function. Over time, this creates a body that is familiar with pausing, with waiting, with allowing recovery to take its course without external pressure. This familiarity becomes part of the baseline experience, so much so that it feels inherent rather than shaped. Yet when you place this pattern alongside the conditions that define most of human existence, it begins to look less like a fixed trait and more like a response to a different kind of world. The body has not simply become slower. It has adapted to a situation where speed is not always required, where recovery can be distributed across time rather than concentrated into urgent intervals. And within that distribution, the sense of delay emerges, not as a failure to heal, but as a reflection of how the body is now allowed to move through the process of repair without the same constraints that once defined its pace. There is a way to understand the body that becomes clearer when you imagine it without the option to wait. Not resting after strain, not delaying movement until strength fully returns, but continuing in a state that is not complete, not fully restored, and yet still required to function. In such a condition, recovery cannot be something that happens later. It must begin immediately, and it must unfold while the body is still in use. This is difficult to picture from within a life where pauses are available, where stillness can be chosen, where the body can step away from demand. But for most of human existence, stepping away was not always possible. The environment did not pause when the body did. Cold did not soften. Distance did not shorten. Hunger did not wait. Under those conditions, the body had to organize itself around a different rule, one in which delay carried a cost that could not be ignored. If a joint was strained, it still needed to support weight. If muscles were fatigued, they still needed to contract with enough strength to maintain movement. If the skin was broken, it still needed to protect what lay beneath it, even before it had fully closed. Recovery, in that sense, was not an isolated event. It was part of a continuous adjustment, one that allowed the body to remain functional while still undergoing repair. This does not imply that the body healed instantly or without limitation. Rather, it suggests that the timing of recovery was shaped by necessity, by the need to restore enough function quickly enough to continue interacting with a demanding environment. The processes within the body repairing tissue, regulating energy, stabilizing internal systems were all influenced by this constant interaction. They were not optimized for comfort or completeness, but for sufficiency. Enough strength to stand, enough stability to move, enough protection to avoid further harm. This threshold of enough may have been lower than full recovery, but it had to be reached without delay. Over time, this created a pattern in which the body did not wait to be fully restored before resuming activity. It returned to action as soon as a minimal level of function was regained, and continued repairing itself while still engaged with the world. This pattern is different from one in which recovery is expected to bring the body back to a prior, complete state before use. It reflects a system that is comfortable with partial restoration, with operating in an in-between condition where healing and activity overlap. When the environment no longer requires this overlap, when it allows for extended rest, the pattern begins to shift. the body can move closer to complete recovery before being used again. It can delay action until discomfort subsides. It can separate the phases of strain and repair more clearly. At first, this seems like an improvement, a form of protection that reduces risk. And in many ways it is. But it also changes the internal timing of recovery. Without the pressure to reach that threshold of enough quickly, the body is no longer driven to restore function within a narrow window. It can take longer because it is allowed to. This does not mean that the body has lost its ability to respond quickly when necessary. In moments of acute need, many of these processes can still accelerate. But in the absence of such pressure, the default rhythm becomes slower, more extended, less tightly bound to immediate function. This shift is not dramatic, and it does not happen all at once. It emerges gradually, as the conditions surrounding the body change over long periods of time. What you experience as a slow return of strength or a lingering sense of fatigue may reflect this broader pattern. Not a failure of the body to repair itself, but a difference in how urgently that repair is required to reach a usable state. And when urgency fades, even slightly, the timeline of recovery can stretch. Not because the body cannot act faster, but because it no longer has to. What matters here is not the image of a stronger ancient body, but the kind of world that decided what counted as enough recovery to survive another day. In a demanding landscape, the body did not need to return to perfect condition. It needed to return to workable condition. That distinction seems small, but it changes everything. A fully restored body is one idea, a usable body is another. For most of human history, the second mattered more. If the foot still hurt but could bear weight, movement continued. If the arm had lost some strength but could still carry or pull, the task was not abandoned. If exhaustion had not completely lifted but awareness had returned, the day did not pause in sympathy. The body was asked, again and again, not whether it had healed completely, but whether it could do enough. This is where recovery begins to look less like a clean medical process and more like a negotiation between tissue, energy, and risk. The body had to decide how much repair was necessary before action resumed, and in many cases that threshold was likely lower than modern expectations of rest would suggest. What had to come back first was function, not comfort. Stability, not ease. Movement, not the full disappearance of strain. This does not mean prehistoric humans lived in a constant state of injury. It means the body's repair systems were embedded in a reality where waiting for ideal conditions was often not an option. The earlier origin point of human life helps make this pattern easier to understand. The human body took shape long before villages, roads, heated rooms, or stored food. Its deeper biological rhythms emerged in environments where exposure was normal and uncertainty was constant. In that older world, a body that insisted on full restoration before resuming effort would have been poorly matched to the pace of survival. So the body appears to have been organized around layers of return. First enough balance to remain upright, then enough strength to continue, then enough repair to reduce larger danger. Only later, if conditions allowed, the slower and quieter work of fuller restoration. Even now, traces of that layered pattern remain. A person can still move while tired, still function while slightly ill, still continue after minor injury. The body has not lost its ability to operate in incomplete states. But the surrounding world often encourages a different interpretation of those states. Discomfort becomes a sign to stop entirely. Fatigue becomes a condition to fully resolve before resuming strain. Pain becomes something that separates activity from healing instead of accompanying it. That shift in behavior matters because the body does not recover in abstraction. It recovers within habits, expectations, and environments. When daily life allows a wide distance between damage and demand, the body no longer needs to aim first for fast usability. It can aim for slower completeness. That sounds beneficial, and often it is, but it also means the pace of repair is no longer shaped by the same urgent pressures that once narrowed its timing. In a colder and harsher setting, delayed function carried immediate consequences. In many modern settings, delayed function is inconvenient, but not always dangerous. This difference may help explain why recovery can feel softer now, more stretched, less decisive. The body is still repairing. It is still capable of meeting need, but the kind of need that dominates everyday life has changed. What once required swift restoration of movement now often allows a period of withdrawal, sitting, reduced effort, or postponed exertion. And when that pattern repeats across long stretches of life and across generations living in more buffered environments, the felt experience of recovery changes with it. The important point is not that ancient humans were simply better at healing. That would be too blunt, and the evidence does not support such a simple contrast. The more careful point is that the body may once have been more tightly governed by the need to reach usable function quickly. Once that need loosened, the rhythm of recovery could loosen with it. So when the body today seems to move back towards strength in slow stages, it may be following a logic that no longer answers to the same world. Not broken logic, not weak logic, just a different timing, shaped by the fact that the question surrounding recovery is no longer, in most moments, can you continue now? But rather, how long can you afford to wait? There is a quiet consequence hidden inside this difference between full recovery and usable recovery. When a body is shaped by conditions that repeatedly ask for immediate function, it becomes familiar with returning in stages. Not all at once, and not perfectly, but in a sequence that favours what must come back first. Balance returns before comfort. Strength enough for movement returns before complete ease. Alertness returns before deep restoration. This sequence makes sense in a world where survival depends on continuing before healing is finished. It is not an elegant system in the modern sense, but it is practical. The body does not wait for the final layer of repair before re-entering the demands of the day. It restores what is most necessary, then keeps going while the rest catches up more slowly in the background. That older pattern may help explain why the human body can still do surprising things under pressure even now. People can endure more than they expect for short periods. They can keep moving while tired, act while frightened, work through discomfort, and function while not fully restored. These abilities suggest that the body still carries an older logic, one built not around ideal conditions, but around urgency. Yet what happens after the urgent moment has passed is just as important. In many present-day settings, once the pressure lifts, the body is no longer forced to stay within that older rhythm. It can withdraw from effort more completely. It can stretch the later phases of repair across longer periods. It can allow the quieter, slower parts of recovery to dominate the experience. This means that what we often feel is not only the body's ability to return, but its ability to return in the absence of immediate threat. And that absence changes the whole texture of healing. It becomes less sharp, less compressed, less clearly tied to a narrow survival window. The deeper origin of this pattern reaches back to the long human past, before permanent settlement, before stored abundance, before most of the structures that now buffer the body from direct environmental pressure. For a very long time, humans lived in conditions where energy, movement, weather, and bodily integrity were tightly linked. A strained leg was not simply a private discomfort. It could shape access to food, shelter, or group movement. A lingering weakness was not merely frustrating. It could alter a person's place within the pace of daily survival. Under those conditions, the body's internal priorities were likely shaped again and again by the need to restore enough function quickly, even if complete restoration had to wait. That is the important distinction. The body was not necessarily finishing recovery faster in every deep biological sense. Rather, it may have been pushed to front-load recovery differently, bringing forward what mattered most for immediate use. This is a more careful and more believable way of understanding the past. It avoids turning prehistoric life into a myth of perfect toughness, while still allowing us to see that the demands placed on the body were not the same as they are now. In the present, many forms of recovery happen in a world filled with interruption, artificial routine, uneven movement, and long stretches in which the consequences of reduced function are softened. A person can remain indoors, they can delay exertion, they can postpone certain demands until tomorrow. Even when life feels busy, it often does not expose the body to the same kind of direct environmental bargaining that shaped earlier human existence. As a result, the body's recovery is no longer always pulled toward quick usability by outside necessity. It can spread itself differently across time. This may be why modern recovery often feels less like a rapid return and more like a gradual reassembly. The body is still doing its work, but not always under the same rules. And when you notice that your strength, energy, or resilience does not return as quickly as you feel it should, the most useful question may not be whether the body has simply become worse. It may be whether the body is still carrying systems formed in a harsher world, while now living in one that no longer calls them into action in quite the same way. The slowness, then, is not only inside the body, it may also come from the distance between the body's ancient design and the quieter, more buffered world in which it is now allowed to recover. If the idea of recovery has shifted over time, one way to approach it more carefully is to look for traces that remain outside of the body's immediate experience, in places where time leaves a physical record. Human bone is one of those places. It changes slowly, it endures, and under certain conditions, it preserves evidence of both injury and repair. When a bone breaks and later heals, it does not return to its exact original form. It leaves behind a mark, a thickened area, a slight irregularity, a visible reminder that damage occurred and that the body responded. These marks do not tell a complete story, but they offer something rare, a point of contact between the internal processes of recovery and the external record of history. Across different regions and time periods, archaeologists have identified skeletons showing signs of healed fractures, worn joints, and other forms of physical stress that were not immediately fatal. The presence of healing is important. It suggests that individuals did not simply experience injury and disappear from the record. Some injuries were survived, and more than that, survived long enough for the body to begin and in many cases complete the process of repair. This does not mean that recovery was always quick, or that outcomes were always good. Some injuries likely led to lasting limitations. Others may have required support from nearby individuals. But the repeated appearance of healed bone indicates that the human body, even under demanding conditions, was capable of restoring structural integrity to a meaningful degree. That restoration had to reach a point where the individual could continue living, at least for some time after the injury occurred. The deeper origin of the human body becomes relevant here again. The skeletal system developed over long periods in environments where mobility mattered, where balance, coordination, and the ability to move across uneven ground were essential. A broken bone, especially in a limb, would have interfered with these functions. The fact that healing occurred often enough to be visible in the archaeological record suggests that the body's repair processes were not rare exceptions, but part of a broader pattern of survival. At the same time, it is important to remain careful. The record we see is incomplete. It shows only those individuals whose remains were preserved and later discovered. It does not show how many injuries failed to heal, or how long recovery took in each case. It does not capture the daily experience of pain, limitation, or gradual return to function. What it does offer is a boundary, proof that recovery happened often enough to leave physical traces, even in periods where environmental pressure was high and medical intervention, as we understand it now, did not exist. This boundary is useful because it prevents the discussion from drifting into extremes. It avoids the idea that ancient humans were constantly incapacitated by injury, unable to recover. It also avoids the opposite idea that they healed rapidly and completely in all cases. The evidence supports a middle ground. Recovery occurred, sometimes sufficiently for continued life, sometimes leaving visible marks of its process. When this is placed alongside the earlier idea of usable recovery, a clearer picture begins to form. The body may not have needed to erase all signs of damage in order to function again. It may have needed to restore enough strength and stability to continue moving, even if the final structure was altered. This is consistent with the way healed bone appears, not identical to what came before, but strong enough to hold. When you bring this back to the present moment, the connection is not direct, but it is suggestive. The body still carries the same fundamental systems of repair. It still responds to damage with a sequence of processes aimed at restoring structure and function. But the context in which those processes unfold has changed. The archaeological record shows that recovery was possible under pressure. The question that follows is not whether the body has lost that capacity, but how the absence of that pressure might influence the pace and pattern of recovery now. And that question does not require a dramatic answer. It can remain open, shaped by the quiet evidence of bone, by the slow marks left behind by injury and healing, and by the recognition that the body's past and present are connected not by certainty, but by a long and continuous process of adjustment. If bone can preserve the outline of injury and repair, it can also hint at something quieter, something that is not immediately visible but can be inferred from the way healing is distributed across a skeleton. Not every part of the body leaves the same kind of trace. Soft tissues fade without record, and many internal processes leave no direct mark. But the pattern of healed injuries when observed across different remains suggests that recovery was not a single moment but a span of time during which the body remained active in some form. A fracture that shows signs of solid healing likely required weeks or longer to stabilize. During that time, the individual could not have been entirely removed from their surroundings. Movement, even if limited, would still have been necessary. The body, therefore, was not waiting in stillness for complete repair. It was existing within the process, adjusting to it, and continuing to interact with the environment while healing was underway. This idea becomes clearer when considering injuries that would have affected balance or mobility. A leg that had been broken and later healed implies that, at some point during recovery, weight had to be gradually reintroduced. The bone did not become strong again in isolation. It responded to use, to pressure, to the forces placed upon it as the individual returned, step by step, to movement. This gradual return does not leave a precise timeline in the bone, but it does suggest that healing and use overlapped. The body was not separating these phases completely. It was integrating them. The deeper origin of human movement supports this interpretation. For most of human history, movement was not optional. It was tied to daily survival, to finding food, maintaining warmth, and staying within a group. A body that could not move at all for extended periods would have faced significant difficulty. This does not mean that complete rest never occurred, but it suggests that prolonged immobility carried risks that may have influenced how recovery unfolded. The body may have been guided, both internally and externally, toward resuming function as soon as it was possible to do so safely. When you compare this to the present, a difference in context becomes visible again. Modern recovery often allows for extended periods of reduced movement. A person can remain seated, supported, or otherwise removed from physical demand while healing progresses. This can protect the injured area and reduce the risk of further harm, but it also changes the relationship between healing and use. The body is given more time before it is asked to function again. The phases become more clearly separated. Injury, rest, gradual return. In earlier conditions, those phases may have been less distinct. They may have overlapped more, with the body negotiating between repair and necessity at each stage. This overlapping could influence not only the experience of recovery, but also its pace. When use returns earlier, even in a limited way, certain systems may be engaged sooner. Circulation, muscle activity, and mechanical stress all play roles in how tissues respond over time. This does not guarantee faster healing in every case, and it does not suggest that more activity is always better. It simply points to a different structure of recovery, one in which the boundary between healing and function is less clearly defined. The archaeological record, limited as it is, aligns with this possibility. It shows that healing occurred often enough to be visible, and that individuals lived through periods of injury that required time to resolve. It does not show a world of complete stillness during recovery, but one where healing was likely interwoven with continued existence in a demanding environment. Bringing this back to the present, the difference is not meant to imply that one approach is superior. Modern conditions reduce many risks and allow for safer, more controlled recovery. But they also remove the constant external pressure that once shaped the timing of that recovery. Without that pressure, the body is free to follow a slower path if it does not need to accelerate. The result is not a loss of ability, but a change in how and when that ability is expressed. What you feel as a gradual return, a lingering process, may reflect this shift. The body is still capable of rebuilding, still able to respond to damage, but it is doing so within a context that no longer demands immediate reintegration into a challenging environment. The pace, therefore, is not only a property of the body itself, it is also a reflection of the space the body is given to heal within. And that space, now wider and more forgiving than it once was, allows recovery to extend in ways that were not always possible in the deeper past. Bone does something unusual in the history of the body. It keeps a memory, but not in words, and not in detail. It remembers through shape, A fracture that healed years before death can still remain visible long after the person is gone, held in a ridge, a thickened line, or a slight bending of structure. Because of this, bone allows us to ask a careful question, not simply whether ancient humans were injured, but whether they lived long enough and functioned well enough for healing to leave its mark. Again and again, the answer appears to be yes, though never in a simple or romantic form. A healed fracture does not tell us that life was easy. It tells us that the body continued its work under conditions that were often far from ideal. It tells us that damage was not always the end of use. Something in the person's body, and likely in the support around that person as well, made continuation possible. That is important because it shifts the focus away from a fantasy of prehistoric strength and toward a more grounded reality. Recovery had to operate inside ordinary difficulty. The older human world was not arranged to protect healing. It was not built around comfort, reduced strain, or controlled routines. For long stretches of human history, the body emerged and lived in conditions where weather, terrain, and daily movement remained close to survival itself. In that setting, even a recovering body still belonged to the landscape. It still had to face cold, distance, imbalance, and uneven effort. So when bone shows that healing occurred, the deeper suggestion is not merely that tissue repaired itself, but that repair happened in a body still tied to use. The person may not have returned to perfect condition. The bone itself often shows that clearly. But perfect condition may not have been the relevant threshold. What mattered more was whether function returned enough for life to continue. This is where the archaeological trace becomes especially useful. It reminds us that the question is not whether ancient humans became untouched by injury, but whether the body could recover enough under pressure to remain part of the world around it. And the evidence suggests that it often could. Even visible deformity after healing does not weaken that point. In some ways, it strengthens it. A bone that healed imperfectly but held long enough for continued life shows the same broader pattern seen in earlier reflections on usable recovery. The body may not always have aimed first for complete restoration, but for stability, continuity, and sufficient return. That distinction matters because it helps keep this topic honest. It prevents the story from turning into an exaggerated claim that humans in the Ice Age simply healed better in every way. The evidence does not say that. What it says, more quietly, is that human recovery once unfolded within a harsher frame, one in which returning to some degree of usefulness could not be delayed without consequence. The body had to close enough, strengthen enough, support enough, and once that threshold was reached, life could continue even while traces of injury remained. When that older pattern is compared with the present, the contrast is not between ability and inability, but between different relationships to necessity. Modern life often allows recovery to happen at a greater distance from direct physical demand. An injury can be surrounded by protection. Weakness can be hidden indoors. Fatigue can sometimes be carried passively rather than through movement. All of this changes the meaning of delay. In the deeper human past, delay may have narrowed the person's ability to remain engaged with the environment. Now, delay is often absorbed by systems around the body, by shelter, storage, reduced exposure, and postponed effort. The body still heals, but it does so in a wider and softer margin. The archaeological record does not prove that recovery was universally faster after injury in the past, and it should not be used to make that claim. What it does show is that healing often occurred in bodies that were unlikely to have been fully removed from the demands of daily life. That alone supports an important idea. Human recovery was shaped for a very long time in conditions where repair and participation remained closely linked. Bone preserves just enough of that truth to keep the question alive. If healed fractures from the past still carry the outline of survival, then perhaps the slowness felt now is not evidence that the body has forgotten how to recover, but evidence that it is recovering in a world that no longer asks the same things of it, or asks them in the same order. To understand why recovery might change over time, it helps to look not only at what the body can do, but at what it must spend in order to do it. Repair is not a neutral process. It requires energy, materials, and coordination across many systems that are already balancing other demands. When tissue is damaged, the body begins a sequence of responses that involve rebuilding structure, maintaining stability, and protecting against further harm. These processes draw on resources that are also needed for movement, temperature regulation, awareness, and basic survival. In a setting where resources are limited or unpredictable, this creates a quiet tension. Energy used for repair cannot be used elsewhere at the same moment. The body must decide, in a sense, how to distribute what it has. This distribution is not a conscious choice, but a pattern shaped by long periods of adaptation. In colder environments, maintaining body heat requires a continuous supply of energy. Movement across uneven ground requires coordination and muscular effort. Remaining alert to the surroundings also carries a cost. When these demands are constant, the body cannot simply direct all available energy toward repair without risking failure in other areas. Instead, it may favor a strategy in which repair is prioritized just enough to restore necessary function, while preserving enough energy to continue interacting with the environment. This does not mean that healing stops. It means that healing is managed within a broader system of competing needs. The deeper origin of this pattern can be traced back to the long periods in which human physiology developed under fluctuating and often constrained conditions. Food was not always available in regular intervals. Exposure to cold or heat could not always be avoided. Movement was often required to obtain resources rather than chosen for its own sake. In such a world, the body could not assume that it would always have the surplus needed to support rapid and complete repair at any given moment. It had to operate within limits, adjusting its processes according to what was available. When a wound occurred, the body needed to begin repair, but it also needed to continue generating heat, sustaining movement, and maintaining awareness. These overlapping requirements likely shaped a form of recovery that was efficient in terms of survival, but not necessarily maximal in speed or completeness at every stage. Over time, this created a system that balances repair with other essential functions rather than isolating it as a single priority. When the environment changes, the balance can shift. In more stable conditions, where food is more predictable and exposure can be reduced, the body may have greater flexibility in how it allocates energy. It can support more extended phases of repair without immediate risk to survival. It can allow certain processes to unfold more slowly because the consequences of delay are less immediate. This does not mean that modern humans always have more energy available in a simple sense. The body still faces demands, and energy is still finite, but the nature of those demands has changed. They are often less directly tied to immediate physical survival, and more distributed across different kinds of activity. As a result, the urgency that once drove rapid restoration of function may no longer be as consistently present. The body's systems remain capable, but the signals that push them toward faster action are not always triggered in the same way. This can create a recovery pattern that feels slower, not because the underlying mechanisms are weaker, but because they are operating under different constraints. The pace of healing becomes less compressed, less tightly linked to a narrow window of necessity. It can extend over time, drawing on available resources without the same pressure to complete quickly. When you feel that a minor injury takes longer to resolve, or that strength returns in gradual steps rather than a quick rebound, part of that experience may be tied to this broader shift. The body is still performing the same essential work, but it is doing so within a system that balances repair against a different set of demands than those that shaped its deeper origins. The result is not a failure to heal, but a redistribution of effort across time, one that reflects a world where immediate restoration is not always required for continued survival. When energy is limited or uncertain, the body cannot treat every process with equal urgency, and this becomes especially clear during recovery. Repairing tissue is not only a matter of time, it depends on the availability of fuel, on the ability to circulate nutrients, and on the coordination of many small adjustments that unfold quietly beneath awareness. If energy arrives in uneven amounts, the pace of these adjustments can also become uneven. There may be periods when repair moves forward more quickly, followed by periods when it slows, not because the body has stopped responding, but because it is redistributing what it has. In a setting where food intake fluctuates and physical demands remain constant, this pattern would not be unusual. The body would be required to continue functioning even when resources for repair were not fully available, and to resume deeper restoration when conditions improved. This creates a form of recovery that is flexible, but also dependent on context. It is not fixed to a single speed. It expands and contracts with the flow of available energy. The earlier origin of human life reinforces this idea. For long stretches of time, access to food was shaped by movement, by season, and by chance. There were likely periods of relative abundance and periods of scarcity, and the body had to adjust across both. During times of scarcity, energy would be directed first toward processes that could not be delayed without immediate consequence, such as maintaining core functions and enabling basic movement. Repair, while still important, might proceed at a slower pace or focus first on restoring minimal stability. During times of greater availability, more energy could be directed toward rebuilding and strengthening, allowing recovery to continue more fully. This alternating pattern does not leave a clear trace in the archaeological record, but it aligns with what is known about how biological systems respond to changing conditions. It suggests that recovery was not always a smooth, uninterrupted progression, but often a process that adapted to the rhythms of the environment. In contrast, many modern conditions provide a more continuous flow of energy, at least in the sense that food is more regularly accessible. This might seem like it would lead to consistently faster recovery, and in some cases it does, but it also changes how the body organizes its priorities. When energy is more predictable, the urgency to direct it immediately toward repair may be reduced. The body is not required to take advantage of a brief window of availability in the same way. It can distribute repair over a longer period, integrating it with other processes without the same pressure to complete quickly. This does not mean that recovery becomes less effective. It means that it can become less compressed. The timeline can stretch because the need to concentrate repair into short, high-priority intervals is less pronounced. There is also another layer to consider. In a world where immediate physical survival is less often threatened, the body may encounter different kinds of demands that also draw on its energy. These demands may not always be visible in the same way as cold or hunger, but they still require allocation of resources. The body must balance these ongoing needs with repair, just as it did in the past, but the nature of the balance has shifted. The result is a system that continues to adjust, but under a different set of influences. When you feel that recovery is slower or more gradual, part of that experience may come from this redistribution. The body is still working, still repairing, but it is doing so in a way that reflects a more extended timeline, one that is less tightly bound to immediate external pressure and more shaped by a steady, ongoing flow of energy and demand. This extended timeline can feel like delay, especially when compared to an expectation of quick return, but it may also represent a different form of efficiency, one that spreads the work of repair across time rather than concentrating it into a single urgent phase. There is a further implication in the way energy is distributed during recovery, and it becomes clearer when you consider not just how much energy is available, but how predictable that availability is over time. When the body cannot rely on a steady supply, it tends to favor strategies that secure immediate stability before investing in longer processes. This does not mean abandoning repair, but organizing it in layers, allowing the most urgent needs to be addressed first while leaving deeper restoration to unfold when conditions permit. In such a system, the body learns to respond quickly when necessary, not because it always has more energy, but because it cannot assume that energy will be there later. This creates a kind of front-loading, where early stages of recovery are emphasized, bringing the body back to a usable state as soon as possible. The later stages, which may refine, strengthen, or complete the repair, can take more time and depend more heavily on future conditions. Over long periods, this pattern may become part of how recovery is structured, not as a rigid rule, but as a tendency shaped by repeated exposure to uncertainty. When the environment changes and energy becomes more consistent, this tendency can shift. The body is no longer required to secure immediate function at all costs. It can afford to allow early stages of recovery to proceed at a more measured pace, because the risk of sudden demand is reduced. This does not eliminate the capacity for rapid response. In situations that resemble the pressures of earlier environments, the body can still accelerate certain processes. But in the absence of those pressures, the default pattern may lean toward a more even distribution of effort across time. Instead of concentrating energy into a narrow window of rapid repair, the body can spread that energy across a longer duration, allowing processes to unfold more gradually. This change in timing can be subtle, but it influences how recovery is experienced. What might once have been compressed into a shorter, more intense phase can now extend into a longer, quieter progression. The work of repair is still being done, but it is less visibly urgent. It does not need to reach a threshold as quickly, because the consequences of delay are less immediate. The deeper origin of this pattern again points to the long human past, where unpredictability was a constant feature. Food availability, environmental exposure, and physical demands could change quickly, and the body had to be prepared for that variability. Under those conditions, prioritizing early functional recovery made sense. It allowed the body to regain enough capability to respond to whatever came next, even if full restoration had to wait. In more stable settings, where changes are less abrupt and support systems are more consistent, the advantage of that early emphasis may be less pronounced. The body can allow itself to move more slowly through the initial stages of repair, knowing that it is less likely to be forced into immediate action. This shift does not represent a decline in capacity, but a rebalancing of priorities in response to different conditions. When you notice that recovery unfolds in a gradual way, without the sharp return you might expect, part of that experience may be linked to this broader adjustment. The body is still capable of organizing its energy to repair damage, but it is no longer operating under the same assumptions about what will be required next. It does not need to secure immediate readiness in every case, and so it can allow the process to extend. The result is a pattern of recovery that is less compressed, more distributed, and sometimes perceived as slower. But within that slower rhythm, the body is still following a logic that has been shaped over a very long time, adjusting not only to its own internal needs, but to the changing nature of the world it inhabits. There is a moment in the long timeline of human history when the background conditions begin to soften, not suddenly, and not everywhere at once, but enough to change how the body relates to its surroundings. After the last major glacial period, climates in many regions became more stable. Temperatures rose, extreme cold retreated, and seasonal patterns, while still variable, became less severe than before. This did not create comfort in the modern sense, but it altered the baseline. The environment was no longer as consistently demanding in the same way it had been during colder phases. For a body shaped across earlier conditions, even a small shift in the environment could begin to change the pressures acting upon it. When cold becomes less intense, the energy required to maintain body heat can decrease. When plant and animal life become more predictable in certain regions, access to food can become slightly more stable. Movement is still necessary, but the reasons for that movement begin to change in subtle ways. Instead of constant repositioning in response to harsh conditions, there can be longer periods spent in areas that provide sufficient resources. These are gradual transitions, not complete transformations, but they introduce a different rhythm to daily life. Within this changing rhythm, the body encounters a new balance between demand and recovery. It is still exposed to injury, still subject to fatigue, but the urgency surrounding these states begins to shift. If the environment allows for slightly longer pauses, if the immediate risk of exposure is reduced, then the body is not always required to return to full function within the same narrow window. Recovery can take on a different shape, not because the body has changed in isolation, but because the world around it is asking different questions. The deeper origin of the human body remains the same, still rooted in earlier conditions, but its expression begins to adapt to this new context. Over generations, small differences in how energy is used, how movement is organized, and how recovery unfolds can accumulate. These differences are not always visible in a single lifetime, but they shape patterns that become more noticeable when viewed across longer spans of time. It is important to remain careful here. The transition after the Ice Age did not remove difficulty from human life. Environments could still be harsh, resources could still be uncertain, but the type of pressure changed. It became less consistently tied to extreme cold and constant movement, and more varied depending on region, season, and local conditions. This variation allows for a broader range of responses from the body. In some contexts, rapid recovery remains necessary. In others, there is space for a slower return. This range introduces flexibility into the system, and with that flexibility comes a change in the average pace at which recovery is experienced. When you compare this to the earlier idea of tightly compressed recovery under constant pressure, the difference becomes clearer. In a colder, more demanding environment, the body is repeatedly pushed toward quick restoration of function. In a more stable environment, that push is less constant. It still exists, but it is not present in the same way at every moment. The body, responding over long periods, adjusts to this change. It does not abandon its ability to recover quickly, but it is not required to use that ability as often. As a result, the overall rhythm of recovery can begin to spread out. This spreading is subtle, and it does not produce a sharp boundary between past and present. Instead, it creates a gradual shift in how recovery fits into the flow of daily life. The body still heals, still responds to damage, but the timing of that response is influenced by a world that has become, in certain ways, less immediately demanding. This does not lead to a simple conclusion about better or worse. It points instead to a change in relationship between the body and the environment, between urgency and possibility, between what must be done quickly and what can be allowed to unfold over time. As the environment becomes less dominated by extreme cold and constant exposure, another change begins to appear, not in a single place, but across many regions over long stretches of time. The landscape starts to offer pockets of relative stability. Rivers follow more predictable paths. Vegetation in certain areas returns with seasonal regularity. Animal movement patterns, while still shifting, become somewhat more consistent in relation to these environmental cycles. None of this removes uncertainty, but it creates moments where the body is not under continuous, unbroken pressure. These moments matter because they allow a different relationship between effort and recovery to take shape. When the environment briefly holds still, even in a limited way, the body is given space to pause without immediate consequence. This pause does not need to be complete or prolonged to have an effect. Even small extensions of rest, repeated over time, can begin to change how recovery is experienced. The body is no longer required to compress all repair into narrow windows between demands. It can extend those windows slightly, allowing processes that were once tightly bound to urgency to unfold with less constraint. The deeper origin of human physiology still carries the imprint of earlier conditions, where such pauses were less available. But as these new patterns of stability appear, the body does not ignore them. It responds, gradually adjusting how it allocates energy, how it sequences repair, and how it balances activity with restoration. Over generations, these adjustments do not rewrite the body's basic structure, but they influence its timing. The rhythm of recovery begins to include more variation. There are still moments of rapid response when conditions demand it, but there are also increasing moments where the body can afford to slow down. This variability becomes part of the overall pattern. It is not a switch from fast to slow, but a widening of the range within which recovery can occur. In earlier conditions, the lower end of that range may have been less accessible because slowing down carried greater risk. In these changing environments, that lower end becomes more usable. The body can move into it without immediate danger, and so it begins to do so more often. This does not mean that life becomes easy, or that recovery becomes effortless. Injury still occurs. Fatigue still accumulates. But the consequences of taking longer to return to full function are not always as immediate or severe as they once were. The body, sensing this shift over long periods, adapts in subtle ways. It does not need to maintain the same constant readiness for rapid recovery, because the world no longer requires it at every moment. When you consider this alongside the earlier idea of energy distribution, the connection becomes clearer. A more stable environment can support a more evenly distributed use of energy over time. Repair does not need to be concentrated into short bursts. It can be spread out, integrated with other processes, and allowed to proceed at a pace that reflects both internal needs and external conditions. This spreading can feel like slowness when compared to an expectation of quick return, but it may also represent a form of alignment with a different kind of environment. The body is still responding to damage, still working to restore itself, but it is doing so within a context that no longer compresses its actions into the same narrow frame. The result is a recovery process that is less urgent, more gradual, and more adaptable to variation. And because this change emerges over long periods, it becomes part of the baseline experience, something that feels natural even though it reflects a shift from earlier patterns. The body has not forgotten how to act quickly, but it is no longer required to do so as often. In that difference, small at first and then repeated over generations, the sense of slower recovery begins to take shape, not as a single change, but as a gradual widening of time around the act of healing. As these small pockets of stability become part of the broader human experience, another shift begins to emerge, one that is not tied only to the environment itself, but to how the body anticipates the future. In a world defined by constant uncertainty, the body operates under an assumption that demand can return at any moment. This assumption keeps many systems oriented toward readiness, toward maintaining a level of function that can be called upon quickly. But when the environment becomes even slightly more predictable, when certain patterns repeat often enough to be expected, the body can begin to operate under a different assumption. It can allow for the possibility that demand may not return immediately. This change in expectation does not happen in a conscious way, but through repeated exposure to conditions where immediate response is not always required. Over time, the body adjusts, not by removing its capacity for rapid action, but by altering how often that capacity is activated. This adjustment influences recovery in a quiet but meaningful way. If the body no longer expects that it must return to full or near full function within a short window, it can allow recovery to proceed with less urgency. The processes that rebuild, stabilize, and restore can unfold across a broader span of time, without the same internal pressure to reach a threshold quickly. This does not mean that recovery becomes passive or inactive. It means that its pace is less tightly bound to an anticipated demand. The deeper origin of this pattern can still be traced to earlier conditions, where unpredictability shaped a constant need for readiness. But as predictability increases, even in limited forms, the body begins to incorporate that information into its baseline behavior. It does not abandon readiness entirely, but it distributes it differently across time. There may be periods where readiness is high, followed by periods where it relaxes slightly, allowing more space for gradual processes like repair to continue without interruption. This distribution creates a different internal rhythm, one that is not always aligned with the sharp cycles of demand and response that characterized earlier environments. Instead, it reflects a more extended pattern, where activity, rest, and recovery blend into one another over longer intervals. When you compare this to the earlier idea of compressed recovery under constant pressure, the contrast becomes clearer. In a setting where demand is unpredictable and often immediate, the body must assume that it cannot delay its return to function. In a setting where patterns become more recognizable, where certain needs can be anticipated or postponed, the body gains a degree of flexibility. It can allow itself to move more slowly through certain phases, including recovery, because the risk of sudden demand is reduced. This flexibility does not eliminate the need for repair. It changes how that need is expressed over time. The result is a recovery process that is less tightly synchronized with immediate survival and more integrated into a broader, more variable flow of daily life. This integration can feel like a loss of sharpness, a fading of the quick return that might be expected under more demanding conditions. But it can also be understood as an adjustment to a different kind of world, one where the body is not always required to prove its readiness at every moment. The sense of slower recovery, then, may not be a direct weakening of the body's systems, but a reflection of how those systems are now allowed to operate within a landscape that offers more time, more predictability, and more space between moments of necessity. There is another change that unfolds gradually after the environment becomes more stable, and it does not come from climate alone, but from how humans begin to organize their lives within that environment. Movement, which had once been continuous and closely tied to survival, starts to shift in its purpose and pattern. Instead of following wide and often unpredictable paths across landscapes, human groups in many regions begin to return to the same places more frequently. Over long stretches of time, this repeated return can become a form of staying, not permanent in the earliest stages, and not uniform across all populations, but enough to alter the rhythm of daily life. When movement becomes more localized, the body encounters a different relationship with effort. It still moves, still lifts, still carries, but the range and variation of that movement begin to narrow. Instead of adapting constantly to new terrain, new distances, and new conditions, the body adapts more often to familiar surroundings. The ground is known, the distances are repeated, the patterns of effort become more predictable. This predictability does not remove strain, but it changes its character. Strain becomes less about sudden adaptation to changing environments, and more about repeated use within a stable one. The deeper origin of the human body, shaped in conditions where movement was varied and often essential for survival, meets this new pattern with a subtle shift. Systems that once operated under a wide range of demands now begin to experience a narrower range more consistently. Muscles are still used, but often in more repetitive ways. Joints still bear weight, but under more regular patterns. The body adjusts to this change, not by becoming inactive, but by reorganizing how it distributes effort across time. This reorganization has implications for recovery. When movement is varied, different parts of the body are engaged in different ways, allowing some areas to recover while others are active. When movement becomes more repetitive, the same structures may be used more frequently without as much variation. This can create a different kind of demand on the body, one that is less about adapting to new conditions and more about managing repeated strain. Recovery in this context is not only about repairing isolated injuries, but about responding to patterns that accumulate over time. This accumulation does not always produce immediate damage, but it can influence how quickly the body returns to a sense of balance after effort. The environment, now more stable, allows for periods of rest, but the nature of the effort itself has changed. It is less dispersed across many different actions and more concentrated in repeated ones. This concentration can alter how the body experiences fatigue and how it moves through recovery. It may no longer be responding to a single event that requires rapid restoration, but to a series of smaller demands that build gradually. In such a setting, recovery can become less about quick return after a single strain and more about ongoing adjustment to repeated use. This difference is subtle, and it does not apply equally to all individuals or all activities, but it contributes to a broader pattern. The body is no longer only responding to sudden, varied challenges. It is also responding to consistent, repeated ones. When you consider this alongside the earlier shifts in environment and energy distribution, a more complete picture begins to form. Recovery is not a single process with a fixed speed. It is shaped by how the body is used, by the patterns of movement it repeats, and by the conditions in which those patterns occur. As human life becomes more localized and more structured around familiar spaces, the body adapts to that structure. It continues to repair itself, but the timing and texture of that repair reflect the new patterns it is experiencing. The result is not simply a slower body, but a body responding to a different kind of demand, one where recovery is woven into repeated cycles of use rather than concentrated into short intervals between unpredictable challenges. As movement becomes more localized and repeated, another quiet change begins to take shape, not in how much the body moves, but in how evenly that movement is distributed across the body itself. In a more varied environment, movement tends to shift constantly, adjusting to terrain, distance, and changing tasks. Different muscles are engaged at different times, different joints absorb force in different ways, and the body rarely repeats the exact same pattern for long. This variation creates a kind of natural rotation, where some structures are active while others have time to recover. It is not a deliberate system, but an emergent one, shaped by the unpredictability of the environment. When the environment becomes more familiar and the range of daily tasks narrows, this rotation can become less pronounced. The same actions are performed more often in the same way. The same paths are walked. The same kinds of lifting or carrying are repeated. Over time, this repetition creates areas of the body that are used more frequently and in more consistent ways, while other areas are used less. The body adapts to this pattern, strengthening where it is needed, adjusting where it is stressed, but also accumulating strain in ways that are less dispersed than before. This accumulation is not always immediately visible. It can exist as a low-level background condition, a sense of tightness, fatigue, or imbalance that builds gradually rather than appearing as a single event. Recovery in this context becomes more complex. It is no longer only about responding to a clear injury or a defined moment of strain. It is also about managing the effects of repeated use that does not fully resolve between cycles. When the same structures are engaged again and again, without enough variation to redistribute load, the body may not have the same opportunity to alternate between use and recovery. Instead, it must repair while continuing to operate within the same pattern. This can slow the apparent pace of recovery, not because the body is incapable of repairing itself, but because the demand does not fully pause. The deeper origin of the human body, shaped in conditions of varied movement, encounters this repetition as a different kind of challenge. Systems that evolve to handle shifting demands now respond to sustained ones. They adapt, but the nature of that adaptation changes the experience of fatigue and repair. What might once have been a brief period of strain followed by a shift in activity becomes a longer sequence of similar demands, requiring ongoing adjustment rather than a clear transition into recovery. When you place this within the broader context of a more stable environment, the pattern becomes clearer. The body is not under constant external pressure to move across changing landscapes, but it is also not receiving the same variety of movement that once distributed effort more evenly. This combination creates a situation where recovery is both less urgent and more continuous. It does not need to happen quickly in response to a single event, but it also does not always have a clear boundary where it can complete fully before the next demand begins. The result is a form of recovery that feels extended, less defined, and sometimes slower to resolve. This does not suggest that earlier patterns were better, or that modern patterns are inherently harmful. It highlights a shift in how the body interacts with its environment and with its own activity. The same biological systems are at work, but they are responding to different patterns of use. When you feel that recovery is incomplete or stretched out, part of that sensation may come from this ongoing interaction, where the body is continuously balancing repair with repeated demand, rather than moving cleanly from one phase to the other. The difference is subtle, but over time it becomes part of the baseline experience, shaping how recovery is perceived and how it unfolds within the flow of daily life. When movement settles into repetition, there is also a change in how the body senses the boundary between effort and recovery. In a more varied setting, shifts in terrain or task naturally create moments where certain muscles rest while others take over. The body moves through cycles without clearly naming them, alternating between strain and relief as part of the same flow. In a more stable setting, where actions repeat with less variation, that boundary can become less distinct. Effort does not always peak and release in clear waves. Instead, it can remain at a steady level, low enough to continue, but constant enough to accumulate. This steady demand can be difficult to notice in the moment because it does not always produce sharp signals. There may be no single point where the body insists on stopping. Instead, there is a gradual layering of fatigue, a quiet build that spreads across hours and days. Recovery, in this context, does not arrive as a clear transition. It becomes something that must occur within the same steady pattern, not outside of it. The body continues to move, continues to repeat familiar actions, while also trying to repair the small imbalances that arise from those actions. The deeper origin of the human body, formed in conditions where movement was more varied and interruptions were often imposed by the environment itself, may not have been shaped for this kind of steady, uniform demand. It is capable of adapting, but the way it adapts changes the experience of recovery. Instead of distinct phases, there is overlap. Instead of clear completion, there is ongoing adjustment. This overlap can make recovery feel incomplete, even when the body is actively working to restore balance. It is not that repair is not happening, but that it is happening alongside continued use, without the same natural breaks that once separated different kinds of effort. When the environment provided those breaks, through shifts in terrain, pauses in movement, or changes in activity, the body could move more clearly between strain and recovery. When those breaks are reduced or replaced by consistent patterns, the body must create its own adjustments within a narrower range. This can extend the time it takes for certain sensations to fade, not because the underlying processes are slower in a simple sense, but because they are constantly interacting with ongoing demand. Over time, this creates a different perception of how the body returns to balance. Recovery feels less like a return to a previous state and more like a gradual rebalancing within a continuing pattern. This perception can be interpreted as slowness, especially when compared to an expectation of quick resolution, but it may also reflect a different structure of experience, one in which the body is never fully removed from use long enough to complete certain processes before they are engaged again. When you consider this alongside the earlier shifts in environment and energy, a consistent theme begins to appear. The body is not simply recovering more slowly in isolation. It is recovering within a system that has changed how and when demands are placed upon it. The pace of recovery is therefore shaped not only by internal capacity, but by the rhythm of use that surrounds it. In a world where that rhythm becomes more even and more repetitive, the body adapts by integrating repair into the flow of activity rather than separating it into distinct phases. The result is a form of recovery that is continuous, subtle, and sometimes difficult to recognize as complete. It does not end as clearly as it might have in a setting where movement and demand were more varied. Instead, it blends into the ongoing pattern of life, leaving behind a sense that the body is always in the process of returning, but rarely arriving all at once. As patterns of movement and environment settle into more predictable forms, another change unfolds more quietly, one that is less visible in the landscape and more deeply tied to what the body receives from it. Food, which had once been gathered or hunted across a wide range of sources, begins in many regions to come from a narrower set of options. This shift does not happen all at once, and it does not occur in the same way everywhere. But over time, as human groups rely more on specific plants or animals within a given area, the diversity of what is consumed can begin to change. The body, shaped across long periods of varied intake, encounters this narrowing as a subtle adjustment. It still receives energy, still has access to nourishment, but the balance of that nourishment can shift in ways that are not immediately obvious. Different foods provide different combinations of substances that support the body's processes, including those involved in repair. When the range of foods is broad, the body draws from a wide set of inputs, some of which may overlap in function, creating a form of redundancy. When the range becomes more limited, that redundancy can decrease. This does not mean that the body cannot function or that it cannot heal. It means that the pathways through which it supports healing may become more dependent on specific sources. If those sources fluctuate or lack certain elements, even slightly, the pace of repair can be influenced. The deeper origin of the human body includes long exposure to variability in diet, not only in terms of availability, but also in composition. Different environments provided different plants, different animals, and different seasonal changes. The body adapted to this variability, developing systems that could operate across a range of inputs. But when variability decreases, when the same types of food are consumed repeatedly over long periods, the body's experience changes. It may become more stable in some ways, but also less flexible in others. Recovery, which depends on a coordinated supply of materials and energy, reflects this change. It does not stop, but it may proceed with different timing depending on what is consistently available. In earlier conditions, periods of abundance and scarcity alternated, and the body adjusted accordingly. In more settled patterns, where certain foods are relied upon more heavily, the fluctuations may be less extreme, but the composition becomes more consistent. This consistency can support regular energy intake, but it can also introduce subtle limitations if the range of nutrients is narrower. Over time, even small differences in composition can influence processes that depend on precise balances, including those involved in repairing tissue and restoring strength. It is important to approach this idea carefully. The archaeological record provides indirect evidence about diet, through remains of plants, animals, and chemical traces in bones and teeth. These sources suggest variation across time and place, rather than a single pattern. Some groups likely maintained diverse diets, while others relied more heavily on specific resources. The effect on recovery would therefore not be uniform. It would vary depending on local conditions and practices. What can be said with more confidence is that the relationship between the body and its food sources has never been static. It has changed alongside environment, movement, and social organization. When you bring this back to the question of recovery, the connection is not a simple cause and effect. It is part of a broader system in which the body's ability to repair is influenced by what it receives, how regularly it receives it, and how those inputs align with its internal needs. A more limited or more repetitive intake does not prevent recovery, but it can shape its pace and its consistency. The body continues to do its work, but the conditions under which it does that work have shifted. What you experience as gradual recovery may, in part, reflect this shift in inputs, not as a deficiency in a dramatic sense, but as a change in the background conditions that support the body's processes. The body remains capable, but its timing is influenced by a landscape of nourishment that is no longer as varied as it once was. And that difference, quiet and cumulative, becomes part of how recovery unfolds over time. When the range of food narrows, the change is not always felt as a lack, but as a quiet sameness that repeats day after day. The body receives enough to continue, enough to move, enough to maintain its basic functions, but the subtle variation that once came from shifting sources becomes less present. This matters for recovery because repair depends not only on the presence of energy, but on the combination of elements that support the rebuilding of tissue and the regulation of internal processes. When intake is varied, small gaps in one source can be balanced by another. When intake becomes more consistent, those gaps, if they exist, may persist over longer periods. This persistence does not stop recovery, but it can influence how smoothly it unfolds. The body may still complete its work, but the timing may change, becoming less even, less predictable, sometimes extending beyond what is expected. The deeper origin of human physiology includes adaptation to change, not only in environment and movement, but in what is consumed. Seasonal shifts once brought different plants and animals into use, each contributing different properties to the body. This constant variation created a kind of background support for processes like repair, where multiple pathways could be engaged depending on what was available. As patterns of living become more settled, that background changes. The body still adapts, but it does so within a narrower set of repeated inputs. Over time, this can influence how the body organizes its internal work. Instead of drawing from a wide range of overlapping sources, it may rely more heavily on a smaller set, adjusting its processes to match what is consistently present. Recovery, in this context, becomes more dependent on the steady flow of these inputs. If the flow is regular, repair can proceed in a steady way. If it is uneven, even slightly, the pace can shift. The body does not pause entirely, but it may move through phases of faster and slower progress depending on what is available at each moment. This creates a pattern that feels less direct than a simple cause and effect. A person may notice that some forms of strain resolve quickly, while others linger without a clear reason. This variation may reflect not only the nature of the strain itself, but the broader conditions under which the body is working to repair it. It is also important to consider that the body does not allocate resources to recovery in isolation. The same inputs that support repair are also used for maintaining other systems. When intake is consistent but limited in variety, the body must distribute what it has across multiple needs. It does not always prioritize one over the others in a fixed way. Instead, it balances them according to internal signals and external conditions. This balancing can influence the pace at which recovery is experienced. The deeper pattern remains one of adjustment rather than failure. The body continues to repair, continues to respond, but the conditions shaping that response have changed. When you compare this to earlier patterns of varied intake, the difference is not that one is inherently better than the other, but that they support different rhythms of internal activity. A varied intake may allow for more overlapping support of different processes, while a consistent but narrower intake may require more careful distribution across time. This distribution can extend the experience of recovery, making it feel gradual, layered, and sometimes incomplete. When you feel that a small injury or a period of fatigue takes longer to resolve than expected, part of that experience may come from this quiet background condition. The body is still receiving what it needs to function, but the pathways through which it supports repair are operating within a more consistent and sometimes more limited framework. The result is not a breakdown, but a shift in timing, where recovery unfolds within the boundaries set by what is regularly available, rather than across the wider variation that once shaped the body's deeper history. As the pattern of intake becomes more regular and more limited in variety, another shift appears, not in what is consumed, but in how the body relates to the timing of that consumption. In earlier conditions, food did not arrive at fixed intervals. It was found, gathered, or hunted, sometimes in abundance, sometimes in scarcity. This created a rhythm in which the body alternated between periods of intake and periods of waiting. During those intervals, the body continued to operate, drawing on stored resources, adjusting its processes according to what was available at the moment. Recovery, as part of those processes, would have been influenced by this rhythm, sometimes supported by recent intake, sometimes unfolding more slowly when resources were being conserved. Over time, this alternating pattern may have shaped a system that is responsive to fluctuation, able to begin repair when conditions allow, and to continue it at a reduced pace when they do not. When patterns of living become more settled, the timing of food intake can also become more regular. meals begin to follow a more predictable structure, even if not as rigid as in later periods. This predictability changes how the body organizes its internal work. Instead of responding to irregular intervals, it can begin to anticipate the arrival of energy and materials. This anticipation can support consistency, but it can also reduce the need to concentrate certain processes into brief windows of availability. Recovery, which once had to take advantage of uncertain opportunities, can now be distributed more evenly across time. The body does not need to accelerate repair immediately after intake in the same way if it expects that intake will continue. It can allow the process to unfold at a steadier pace, integrated with other ongoing functions. The deeper origin of human physiology includes both of these patterns, fluctuation and consistency, but their balance shifts depending on the environment. When fluctuation dominates, urgency shapes the timing of repair. When consistency increases, that urgency can soften. This does not eliminate the body's ability to respond quickly, but it changes how often such responses are required. The body may rely more on a continuous background of repair rather than on bursts tied to moments of intake. This continuous pattern can feel slower because it lacks the sharp transitions that make change more noticeable. It moves quietly, without clear starting and ending points. This subtlety can influence how recovery is perceived. A process that unfolds steadily may be less visible than one that occurs in distinct phases. The body is still repairing, still adjusting, but it is doing so in a way that blends into the flow of daily life rather than standing apart from it. When you compare this to earlier conditions, the difference is not only in what is eaten, but in how the timing of eating interacts with the body's internal processes. Recovery is not separate from these patterns. It is shaped by them, responding to both the presence and the predictability of what the body receives. When that predictability increases, the need for rapid, concentrated repair may decrease. The body can allow itself to move through recovery more gradually, confident that support will continue to arrive. This gradual pace is not a sign that the body has become less capable. It is a reflection of a different relationship between intake and need, one in which the urgency of the past has been replaced, at least in part, by a steadier flow. The result is a form of recovery that is less defined by sharp changes and more by continuous adjustment, unfolding over time in a way that can feel extended even when the underlying processes remain active and effective. There is another layer to recovery that does not always announce itself clearly, yet shapes how the body responds to damage over time. It is the system that detects disruption, signals for repair, and coordinates the response across different parts of the body. In earlier conditions, this system was often engaged by immediate and visible challenges. Cuts, infections, and sudden injuries created clear signals that required a focused response. The body reacted to these events with processes designed to contain, protect, and restore. These responses were not gentle, but they were directed, shaped by the need to resolve a problem that had a clear beginning and, ideally, a clear end. When such challenges were frequent and often acute, the body's response patterns were likely oriented toward rapid activation followed by resolution. Once the immediate threat was contained and basic function restored, the system could quiet again, returning to a lower level of activity until the next event occurred. This pattern, repeated over long periods, creates a rhythm of activation and rest, where recovery is closely tied to specific moments of disruption. As environments change and daily life becomes more stable in certain ways, the nature of the challenges that engage this system can also shift. Instead of being driven primarily by sudden visible events, the body may begin to encounter more subtle ongoing signals. These signals are not always strong enough to trigger a full concentrated response, but they persist over time. They can come from repeated strain, from environmental factors that are less extreme but more constant, or from patterns of living that introduce low-level stress without clear boundaries. In this context, the system that coordinates repair does not always move through clear cycles of activation and resolution. Instead, it may remain active at a lower level for longer periods, adjusting continuously rather than responding to a single event. This continuous activity changes how recovery is experienced. When the body is dealing with a clear injury, the process has a beginning, a progression, and an end that can often be felt. When the body is responding to ongoing subtle signals, the process becomes less defined. There is no single moment when recovery begins or ends. Instead, there is a steady background of adjustment, a quiet effort to maintain balance in the face of repeated low-level challenges. The deeper origin of this system is still rooted in earlier conditions, where acute threats played a significant role in shaping responses. But as the nature of those threats changes, the system adapts. It does not turn off, it reorganizes. It becomes capable of sustaining longer periods of moderate activity, rather than alternating strictly between intense activation and complete rest. This adaptation is useful in a world where challenges are not always sudden or isolated. It allows the body to respond to a wider range of conditions, but it also influences the pace of recovery. When the system is already engaged at a low level, responding to ongoing signals, the addition of a new injury or strain may not produce the same sharp response. The body still reacts, but within an already active context. This can make the process feel slower or less distinct, because it is layered on top of existing activity rather than standing apart from it. When you notice that recovery does not follow a clear path, that it feels extended or less defined, part of that experience may come from this shift. The body is still coordinating repair, still responding to disruption, but it is doing so within a system that is more continuously engaged. The result is a recovery process that blends into the background, unfolding alongside other ongoing adjustments, rather than appearing as a separate, clearly bounded phase. This does not mean that the body is less capable. It means that the context in which it operates has changed, and with that change, the way recovery is expressed has also shifted, becoming quieter, more distributed, and sometimes more difficult to recognize as complete. When the body remains in a state of quiet, ongoing adjustment, another effect begins to appear, not in the intensity of any single response, but in how responses overlap with one another. In a system that moves between clear activation and rest, each event can be resolved before the next one begins. The signals are distinct, the phases are more separated, and the body can direct its resources toward a single problem at a time. When activity becomes more continuous, even at a low level, this separation becomes less defined. Signals do not always arrive in isolation. They layer, intersect, and sometimes compete for attention within the same internal space. The body is still capable of responding, but it must now coordinate multiple demands at once, even if each of those demands is relatively small on its own. This layering can influence how recovery unfolds. When a new strain or minor injury occurs, the system that coordinates repair does not start from a fully quiet state. It is already engaged, already adjusting to other signals. The new demand is added to this background, and the body must integrate it into an ongoing process rather than treating it as a single separate event. This integration does not prevent recovery, but it can change its pace. The response may be less concentrated, less sharply defined, because it is distributed across multiple overlapping processes. Instead of a clear surge of activity followed by resolution, there may be a more gradual shift, where different aspects of repair proceed at different speeds depending on how they interact with the existing background. The deeper origin of the body's response system suggests that it evolved under conditions where challenges were often more distinct in time. A cut, an infection, or a sudden injury would trigger a focused response that could then subside once the threat was managed. This pattern allowed for a clear cycle: activation, resolution, return to baseline. As the nature of challenges changes, with more subtle and continuous signals, the system adapts by maintaining a level of readiness that does not fully return to baseline between events. This readiness is useful, as it allows the body to respond quickly to new inputs. But it also means that the body is rarely operating from a completely neutral starting point. Recovery, therefore, becomes part of an ongoing negotiation, rather than a sequence with clear boundaries. This negotiation can make the experience of healing feel extended. There is no single moment when the body shifts entirely into repair mode, and no clear moment when that mode fully ends. Instead, there is a continuous adjustment, with different processes rising and falling in activity over time. Some aspects of repair may proceed quickly, while others take longer, influenced by how they interact with the broader system. This creates a sense of unevenness, where improvement is present but not always steady or predictable. When you notice that recovery does not follow a simple path, that it seems to progress in stages or linger without a clear endpoint, this layering of responses may be part of the reason. The body is not failing to respond, It is responding within a more complex context, where multiple signals are present and must be managed together. The result is a form of recovery that is less linear and more distributed, shaped by the need to balance several ongoing processes at once. This does not represent a loss of function, but a change in how function is organized over time. The body continues to repair, but it does so within a system that is rarely at rest, and that constant background activity subtly alters the rhythm of healing, making it feel slower, more gradual, and less clearly defined than it might have in a setting where each challenge stood more distinctly on its own. When responses begin to overlap, and the body rarely returns to a fully quiet state, the idea of recovery itself becomes more difficult to locate. It is no longer a clear movement from disruption to restoration, but a shifting balance that is constantly being adjusted. In earlier conditions, where many challenges were more sharply defined, the body could move through more distinct cycles. A disruption would occur, the system would respond, and after some time, the intensity of that response could subside. There was a sense, even if incomplete, of beginning and ending. In a setting where signals persist at a lower level, that sense becomes less clear. The body continues to regulate, to repair, to maintain, but it does so within a field of ongoing activity. Recovery, in this context, does not stand apart from the rest of the body's functions. It blends into them. This blending has an effect on how the body allocates its effort. When the system is responding to multiple subtle signals at once, it may not direct all of its capacity toward a single point of damage. Instead, it distributes its activity, maintaining a broad balance rather than focusing narrowly. This distribution is useful for managing complexity, but it can also mean that any one area of repair progresses more gradually. The body is not neglecting it, but it is placing it within a wider set of priorities. The deeper origin of this system, shaped by conditions where rapid and focused responses were often necessary, still allows for that kind of concentration when needed. In situations that resemble earlier forms of acute challenge, the body can still intensify its response. But when such conditions are not present, the system may remain in a more moderate state, responding without fully escalating. This moderation can extend the timeline of recovery. Processes that might have been compressed into a shorter period under stronger signals can now unfold over a longer span, integrated with other ongoing adjustments. Over time, this creates a different internal landscape. The body becomes accustomed to operating with a constant background of low-level activity rather than moving between clear states of rest and response. In this landscape, recovery is not a separate event, but part of a continuous effort to maintain stability. This continuity can make it difficult to recognize when recovery has been completed, because there is no sharp transition to mark its end. Improvement may be gradual, layered, and sometimes uneven, reflecting the way the body is balancing multiple demands at once. When you consider this alongside earlier shifts in environment, movement, and nourishment, a consistent pattern emerges. The body is not simply healing more slowly in isolation. It is healing within a system that has become more continuous, more distributed, and less defined by clear boundaries. The pace of recovery reflects this structure. It is shaped not only by the capacity of the body to repair itself, but by the context in which that repair is taking place. A context where signals overlap, where responses are sustained, and where the distinction between disruption and restoration is less pronounced than it may have been in the deeper past. This does not point to a decline in function. It points to a reorganization of how function is expressed over time. The body continues to respond, continues to adjust, but it does so in a way that spreads its effort across a wider field of activity. And within that spread, the experience of recovery changes, becoming quieter, more gradual, and less clearly bounded. Even as the underlying processes remain active and ongoing, there is another shift that becomes visible when you look not at what the body faces from the outside, but at how it moves within the space it inhabits. Earlier, movement was not only necessary, but varied in ways that were difficult to repeat exactly. The body adjusted constantly to uneven ground, changing distances, shifting loads, and unpredictable conditions. This variation created a kind of natural diversity in how forces were distributed across muscles and joints. No single pattern dominated for long. Each movement carried slight differences, and those differences allowed the body to share effort across many structures over time. In a more settled environment, the nature of movement begins to change again. It is not that the body stops moving, but that the types of movement become more consistent. Paths are repeated, surfaces become more regular. Tasks are performed in similar ways day after day. Over time, this consistency introduces a new kind of load, one that is less about sudden adaptation and more about sustained repetition. The body responds to this pattern by reinforcing the structures that are used most often. Muscles adjust, joints stabilize, and movement becomes more efficient within the narrow range of tasks that are repeated. This efficiency is useful, but it also concentrates effort. Instead of distributing strain across a wide range of motions, the body directs it more frequently into the same pathways. Recovery within this pattern takes on a different form. It is no longer responding primarily to isolated events, but to the cumulative effect of repeated actions. A joint that is used in the same way each day may not experience a single moment of injury, but it can carry a gradual load that builds over time. Muscles that repeat the same contraction patterns may not fail suddenly, but they may accumulate fatigue in a way that does not fully resolve between cycles. The deeper origin of the human body, shaped in conditions where movement was more varied, encounters this repetition as a shift in context. Systems that evolve to handle diversity must now manage consistency. They adapt, but the nature of that adaptation influences how recovery is experienced. Instead of clear cycles of strain followed by variation and rest, there is a more continuous application of similar forces. This continuity can make recovery feel less complete, not because the body is unable to repair itself, but because the same demands return before the process is fully resolved. When you consider this alongside earlier ideas about energy and environment, the pattern becomes more coherent. The body is not simply dealing with less pressure overall, it is dealing with a different kind of pressure, one that is steady rather than shifting. This steadiness allows certain processes to extend over time. Recovery does not need to be rapid in response to a single event, but it also does not always reach a clear endpoint before being engaged again. The result is a form of repair that is ongoing, integrated into the rhythm of repeated use. This integration can feel like slowness when compared to an expectation of quick resolution, but it may also reflect a different structure of demand, where the body is constantly adjusting to a familiar pattern rather than reacting to unpredictable change. The body still has the capacity for rapid response when needed, but in the absence of varied challenges, that capacity is not always called upon. Instead, the body works within a narrower range, balancing repair with continued use in a way that spreads effort across time. This spreading is subtle, and it does not produce a dramatic change in any single moment. It accumulates, shaping the overall experience of recovery as something that unfolds gradually, often without a clear beginning or end. And in that gradual unfolding, the body reflects the conditions in which it now operates, conditions that are more stable, more predictable, and more repetitive than those that shaped its earliest patterns of movement and repair. When the same patterns of load return again and again, the body begins to organize itself around anticipation rather than surprise. In a varied landscape, each step can differ slightly from the last, and the body must remain responsive to those differences. In a more consistent setting, the body can begin to predict what is coming. Muscles prepare for familiar movements. Joints stabilize along repeated lines of force. This anticipation increases efficiency, allowing the body to perform tasks with less immediate effort. But it also changes how strain is distributed over time. Instead of being spread across many small variations, strain becomes more concentrated along predictable pathways. These pathways become stronger through use, but they also carry a greater share of the ongoing demand. Recovery, in this situation, is not only about repairing damage after it occurs, it is also about maintaining the integrity of structures that are continuously engaged. This maintenance does not always register as a clear event. There may be no distinct injury, no moment where something breaks or fails. Instead, there is a gradual accumulation of small adjustments, a constant effort to keep the system balanced as it moves through repeated cycles. The body is always correcting, always recalibrating, even when the movement itself feels stable. The deeper origin of human movement, formed in conditions where anticipation was limited and adaptation was constant, meets this predictability with a shift in strategy. Systems that once relied on rapid adjustment now rely more on consistency. They become tuned to specific patterns, reinforcing them over time. This tuning can be beneficial, allowing for smoother and more reliable movement within a known environment. But it also means that when strain builds within those patterns, it may not be released as easily through variation. The same movements that create efficiency can also create persistence in how load is applied. When recovery must take place within this persistence, it becomes less about returning to a neutral state and more about sustaining function within an ongoing pattern. The body does not step out of the cycle to repair itself fully. It remains within the cycle, adjusting as it continues. This can extend the timeline of recovery, not because the processes are slower in isolation, but because they are constantly interacting with the same demands that produce the need for repair. The environment, now more predictable, allows for this kind of continuity. There is less need to shift abruptly from one form of movement to another. The body can remain within familiar patterns for longer periods. But that same continuity reduces the natural interruptions that once allowed certain structures to rest while others took over. Without those interruptions, recovery becomes more evenly spread, but also more continuous. It does not concentrate into clear phases that can be easily recognized. Instead, it becomes part of the background of movement, unfolding alongside each repetition. When you feel that a certain area of the body does not fully return to ease, that it improves but never quite resets, this pattern may be part of the reason. The body is maintaining function within a system that does not pause long enough for complete resolution. It is balancing, not finishing. This balance is not a sign of failure. It is an adaptation to a different kind of demand, one that values consistency over variation. The cost of that consistency is a form of recovery that is less distinct, less final, and more integrated into the ongoing rhythm of use. And within that integration, the sense of slowness emerges, not as a lack of capacity, but as a reflection of how the body is now required to manage repair within a steady, repeating flow rather than within the shifting and often interruptive patterns of its earlier past. When load becomes predictable and persists over time, the body begins to rely more heavily on a narrower set of pathways to manage it. These pathways become familiar, reinforced through repetition, and gradually take on a larger share of the work. This specialization brings stability, but it also reduces the range through which force can be distributed. In a more varied pattern of movement, strain can shift from one structure to another, allowing each part of the body moments of relative relief. In a more repetitive pattern, that shifting is reduced. The same joints, the same muscles, and the same connective tissues are asked to respond again and again in similar ways. Over time, this can create a form of quiet concentration, where effort is directed into specific areas with increasing consistency. Recovery within this concentration is no longer a matter of stepping away from use. It becomes a process of maintaining integrity within ongoing demand. The body continues to repair, but it does so while the same structures remain active. This overlap changes how recovery is experienced. Instead of a clear progression toward completion, there is a cycle of partial restoration followed by renewed use. Each cycle may bring improvement, but also reintroduce strain before the process has fully resolved. The deeper origin of the human body, shaped in conditions where movement patterns shifted frequently, would have allowed more natural redistribution of load. When terrain changes, when tasks vary, and when movement is less predictable, the body can rotate through different modes of use. This rotation provides intermittent relief without requiring complete stillness. In a more stable and repetitive environment, that rotation is reduced. The body adapts by strengthening the pathways it uses most, but the opportunity for redistribution becomes less frequent. As a result, recovery becomes more localized and more continuous. It focuses on maintaining specific structures rather than restoring the entire system to a balanced state before use resumes. This localization can influence how quickly certain sensations fade. A structure that is repeatedly engaged may not return fully to a neutral state, because it is never fully released from demand. It remains in a state of ongoing adjustment, improving gradually but not resetting completely. This does not indicate that the body is unable to heal. It reflects the conditions under which healing is taking place. The body is not operating in isolation. It is part of a pattern that repeats, and within that pattern, recovery must find its place. When you consider this alongside earlier shifts in environment, energy, and biological response, a consistent theme emerges. The pace of recovery is not determined by a single factor. It is shaped by how the body is used, how often it is allowed to vary, and how much opportunity it has to redistribute strain. In a world where movement becomes more repetitive and load more persistent, recovery becomes less about returning to a baseline and more about sustaining function within a cycle. This cycle does not have a clear endpoint. It continues as long as the pattern continues, and within it, the body is always adjusting, always repairing, but rarely arriving at a moment of complete resolution. The sense of slow recovery, then, may not be a simple delay in healing. It may be the experience of living within a system where healing is ongoing and intertwined with use, rather than separated from it. The body remains capable, but its work is spread across time, shaped by repetition, and expressed through a gradual process that reflects the steady rhythm of the environment in which it now moves. There is a moment each day when the body begins to withdraw from the outside world, when movement slows and attention turns inward. This moment is quiet, often unnoticed, and yet it plays a central role in how the body restores itself. For a long time in human history, this transition was closely tied to the natural cycle of light and darkness. As daylight faded, activity gradually reduced. As darkness settled, the body moved toward rest, not by strict schedule, but by a pattern shaped by the environment. There were no fixed hours, no consistent artificial extension of light, and no separation between biological rhythm and the world outside. The body followed a sequence that was repeated over many generations, aligning its periods of activity and rest with the changing conditions of the day. Within that alignment, recovery found a place. It was not confined to rest alone, but rest provided a window where certain processes could proceed with fewer interruptions. The deeper origin of human physiology includes this long association between darkness and restoration. In a setting where night limited movement and reduced external demands, the body could shift its focus. Systems involved in repair, regulation, and internal balance could operate with less competition from immediate physical tasks. This does not mean that recovery only happened during these periods, but that these periods offered a different context in which recovery could unfold. As human environments change, this alignment begins to shift. Light is no longer limited to the sun. Activity can continue well into what would once have been a period of rest. The body, while still carrying its earlier rhythms, is now exposed to conditions that extend or fragment those rhythms. Sleep may become shorter, less regular, or interrupted in ways that were less common before. Even when total time spent resting remains similar, the structure of that rest can change. Instead of a continuous period aligned with darkness, it can become segmented, influenced by external schedules and artificial light. This change does not remove the body's need for restoration, but it alters the conditions under which restoration occurs. The processes that depend on regular patterns may need to adjust to irregular ones. They may still function, but not always with the same timing or coordination. Recovery, which is linked to these processes, can be affected in subtle ways. It may become less synchronized, less concentrated within certain periods, and more distributed across the day and night. This distribution can make recovery feel less complete, as if the body is always in the process of restoring itself but rarely reaches a clear point of completion. The deeper origin of the body still holds the capacity for coordinated cycles of activity and rest, but the signals that guide those cycles are now more complex. The environment no longer provides a simple, consistent cue. Instead, the body must interpret multiple signals, some natural, some artificial, and adjust its internal timing accordingly. This adjustment can create variation in how recovery is experienced. On some days, the body may feel restored more quickly. On others, the process may feel extended, influenced by how well the internal rhythm aligned with the external conditions. When you consider this alongside earlier changes in movement, energy, and environment, a pattern continues to emerge. The body's ability to recover is not isolated from the structure of daily life. It is shaped by it. When the structure shifts, even slightly, the experience of recovery can shift as well. The body remains capable of repair, but the timing of that repair reflects the rhythm it is given. In a world where that rhythm becomes less tied to natural cycles and more influenced by variable conditions, recovery may become less sharply defined, unfolding across a wider and less predictable span of time. When the rhythm of rest becomes less anchored to a single, continuous period, the body begins to divide its restoration across smaller segments. Instead of moving into a long, uninterrupted interval where internal processes can unfold in a coordinated sequence, it may shift between shorter periods of rest and activity, each carrying a portion of the work. This division does not stop recovery, but it changes its structure. Processes that once followed a more unified progression may now be distributed, starting, pausing, and resuming in response to changing conditions. The body is still capable of organizing these processes, but the coordination becomes more complex. It must adjust to a pattern where signals are not always aligned, where the transition into rest is not always gradual, and where the return to activity may occur before certain processes have fully completed. The deeper origin of human rest patterns suggests that the body is accustomed to a certain degree of variation, but also to a general coherence in how rest is experienced. Darkness brought a reduction in external input, a quieting of movement, and a relative consistency that allowed internal processes to proceed with fewer interruptions. When that coherence is reduced, when rest is broken into smaller or less predictable segments, the body adapts by spreading its efforts more evenly across time. Recovery becomes less concentrated within a specific window and more continuous, extending into periods that might otherwise have been dedicated to activity. This extension can make the process feel less distinct. There is no single moment where the body fully shifts into restoration, and no clear point where that restoration is complete. Instead, there is a steady background of adjustment, a quiet redistribution of effort that persists across different states of wakefulness and rest. This can influence how quickly certain sensations resolve. Fatigue, for example, may diminish gradually rather than disappearing after a single period of rest. Minor strains may ease over several cycles rather than within one. The body is still repairing, but the timeline is shaped by a pattern that does not allow all processes to align at once. The environment, now filled with variable signals, contributes to this pattern. Light may extend into hours that were once dark. Activity may continue into periods that were once quiet. The body, responding to these signals, must integrate them into its internal timing. It does not lose its capacity for coordinated recovery, but it must distribute that coordination across a more complex set of inputs. This distribution can create a sense of partial completion, where recovery is always underway but rarely feels finished in a single, clear phase. When you consider this alongside earlier shifts in movement and energy, the pattern becomes more consistent. The body is not failing to recover. It is recovering within a structure that divides and redistributes its efforts. What was once concentrated into longer, more unified periods may now be spread across shorter, more variable ones. This spreading changes how recovery is perceived. It becomes less about a clear return and more about gradual adjustment. The body remains active in its work, but that work is less visible, less defined, and more integrated into the flow of daily life. The sense of slowness that emerges from this pattern is not a simple delay. It is the experience of recovery unfolding across multiple segments, each contributing part of the process, but none containing it entirely. And within that segmented rhythm, the body continues to restore itself, quietly, steadily, and without the clear boundaries that once made recovery easier to recognize as complete. When periods of rest become segmented, and the body distributes its recovery across smaller intervals, another subtle effect begins to emerge. The sense of transition, from activity into restoration and back again, becomes less pronounced. In a more continuous pattern, where rest unfolds over a longer and more unified span, the body can move more clearly between states. There is a gradual descent into quiet, a period of sustained internal focus, and then a gradual return to activity. These transitions help organize the body's processes, allowing different systems to coordinate their work within a shared rhythm. When rest is divided, these transitions can become shorter or less defined. The body may enter a state of partial rest without fully disengaging from the signals of the outside world, and then return to activity before certain processes have reached a point of completion. This does not prevent recovery, but it changes how it is structured. Instead of building toward a deeper phase and then resolving, the body cycles through lighter phases more frequently. Each cycle contributes to restoration, but none carries the full weight of it. The deeper origin of human physiology suggests that the body is capable of operating across a range of rhythms, but that certain patterns provide more coherence for internal processes. When those patterns are present, recovery can be more concentrated, allowing different aspects of repair to align and reinforce one another. When the pattern is fragmented, the same processes must adjust, fitting themselves into shorter windows and coordinating across interruptions. This coordination is possible, but it can extend the timeline over which recovery is experienced. The body is still doing the same work, but it is doing it in smaller portions, distributed across time rather than gathered into a single continuous period. This distribution can influence how recovery feels from within. There may be improvement, but it can be gradual, sometimes uneven, and not always tied to a clear moment of rest. A night of sleep may not bring a complete sense of restoration if the underlying pattern has been divided. Instead, recovery may accumulate across several cycles, each adding a small amount to the overall process. The environment, now shaped by artificial light and varied schedules, plays a role in this pattern. It introduces signals that extend or interrupt the natural cues that once guided rest. The body responds by adapting its internal timing, but this adaptation involves a redistribution of effort. Recovery becomes less about a single well-defined phase and more about a series of adjustments that continue across different states of wakefulness and rest. When you place this alongside earlier shifts in movement, energy, and biological response, a consistent theme continues to develop. The body is not simply slower in isolation. It is operating within a system where many of its processes are spread out, less concentrated, and more integrated into a continuous flow. The sense of slower recovery may reflect this spreading. It is not that the body has lost its ability to restore itself efficiently, but that the structure in which that restoration occurs has changed. The boundaries have softened, the phases have blended, and within that blending, recovery becomes quieter, more gradual, and less clearly defined. Even as it continues to take place, there is a kind of demand that does not leave a clear mark on the body in the way that a cut or a bruise does, yet it still requires the body to respond. It is not tied to a single moment of strain, but to a condition that can persist quietly over time. In earlier environments, many of the pressures the body faced were direct and immediate: cold air, physical exertion, the need to move or remain alert. These created signals that were closely linked to action. The body responded, adjusted, and then, when the condition changed, the signal would often subside. There was a rhythm in which demand rose and fell in relation to the environment. As conditions change and human life becomes more structured around stable surroundings, a different pattern can emerge. Some forms of demand become less about immediate physical challenge and more about sustained engagement with situations that do not resolve quickly. These demands may not always require intense physical effort, but they can keep the body in a state of readiness over extended periods. The signals they generate are often subtle, not strong enough to trigger a sharp response, but persistent enough to prevent the system from fully settling. This persistence can influence recovery in ways that are not always obvious. When the body remains in a state of low-level readiness, it does not fully return to a neutral baseline. Instead, it maintains a certain level of activity, adjusting continuously rather than moving between clear phases of response and rest. The deeper origin of the human body suggests that it is well adapted to handle periods of intense demand, followed by periods of relative quiet. In those conditions, recovery can be more clearly defined. The body responds to a challenge, then has the opportunity to shift into restoration once the challenge passes. When demands become more sustained and less clearly bounded, this pattern changes. The body may not experience a distinct end to the signal, and without that end, it may not fully transition into a state where recovery can concentrate. This does not prevent the body from repairing itself. It changes how that repair is organized. Instead of being focused into a defined period, it becomes distributed across time, unfolding alongside the ongoing demands that remain present. This distribution can make recovery feel less complete, because there is no clear moment when the body is entirely free to devote its resources to restoration. It is always balancing, always adjusting, even when the level of demand is low. When you consider this alongside earlier shifts in environment, movement, and rhythm, the pattern continues to align. The body is not simply dealing with less or more demand, but with a different kind of demand, one that is less visible, less sharply defined, and more continuous. Recovery, within this context, becomes part of an ongoing process rather than a separate phase. The body continues to restore itself, but it does so while also maintaining a state of readiness that does not fully switch off. This can extend the timeline of recovery, not because the underlying systems are weaker, but because they are working within a different set of conditions. Conditions where signals persist, where resolution is less clear, and where the boundary between strain and rest is more difficult to draw. The result is a form of recovery that is quieter and more gradual, shaped by a world that asks the body to remain engaged in subtle ways, even when no immediate action is required. When a signal does not clearly end, the body must decide how to live alongside it. It cannot remain in a heightened state indefinitely without cost, and it cannot fully disengage if the signal continues. Instead, it settles into a middle condition, one that is neither fully activated nor fully at rest. This middle condition is quiet, often difficult to notice, but it shapes how the body organizes its internal work. In earlier conditions, many signals were tied to events that resolved. A sudden demand would rise, the body would respond, and once the situation changed, the signal would diminish. The body could then shift more completely into restoration, redistributing its resources toward repair. In a setting where signals persist without clear resolution, that shift becomes less complete. The body continues to respond at a low level, maintaining readiness, adjusting continuously, but without the sharp transitions that once defined its rhythm. This has an effect on recovery. When the body is not fully at rest, it may not allocate its resources to repair in the same concentrated way. Instead, it balances repair with ongoing responsiveness. The work of restoring tissue, recalibrating internal systems, and returning to a state of balance still occurs, but it is spread out, interwoven with the need to remain alert. The deeper origin of the human body suggests that it is capable of moving between states efficiently when the signals are clear. It can activate quickly when needed and return to a quieter state when the need has passed. When signals blur, when they extend over longer periods without clear boundaries, the body adapts by maintaining a steady level of engagement. This adaptation is useful, allowing the body to function in a world where not all demands are immediate or visible, but it also changes the texture of recovery. The body does not step fully into restoration. It carries restoration alongside continued engagement. This carrying can make recovery feel slower, not because the processes themselves are diminished, but because they are not given the same uninterrupted space to proceed. They move forward, but in smaller increments, adjusted around the ongoing presence of low-level demand. Over time, this pattern becomes familiar. The body learns to operate within it, distributing effort across multiple needs rather than concentrating it in a single direction. Recovery becomes part of a continuous balancing act, where no single process fully dominates. When you notice that a sense of fatigue lingers, or that the body does not return to ease as quickly as expected, part of that experience may reflect this middle condition. The body is not failing to restore itself. It is restoring itself while also maintaining a level of readiness that does not fully subside. This dual state is not dramatic, but it is persistent. It shapes how recovery unfolds, making it less distinct and more gradual. When placed alongside earlier changes in environment, movement, nourishment, and rhythm, this pattern fits into a broader shift. The body is responding to a world where many signals are extended, where resolution is less immediate, and where the line between strain and rest is not always clearly drawn. In such a world, recovery becomes quieter, more distributed, and less defined by clear beginnings and endings. It continues to occur, but it does so within a context that asks the body to remain engaged, even as it repairs itself. And within that context, the sense of slower recovery takes shape as part of a larger, ongoing adjustment. When the body remains in this middle condition for extended periods, another change begins to appear, not in the strength of any single response, but in how clearly the body can shift between states. In a system where signals rise and fall with clear boundaries, the transition from engagement to restoration can be more complete. The body responds, then releases, then reorganizes itself in a quieter state before the next demand arrives. This sequence creates space for recovery, to gather momentum, to proceed without interruption, and to reach a point that feels like completion. When signals persist without a clear endpoint, that sequence becomes less distinct. The body does not fully release before the next adjustment begins. Instead, it moves through a continuous series of partial shifts, each one responding to a signal that never entirely disappears. This continuity changes how recovery is organized. It is no longer concentrated into a period where other demands are largely set aside. It becomes interwoven with ongoing responsiveness, sharing time and resources with a background of low-level engagement. The deeper origin of the human body suggests that it can operate in both modes, shifting between clear cycles when signals allow, and maintaining continuity when they do not. But when continuity becomes the dominant pattern, the experience of recovery changes. It becomes less visible, less bounded, and less decisive. The body still repairs, still restores, but it does so without the same sense of transition that once marked the process. Improvement may occur, but it can be gradual and difficult to separate from the ongoing state of engagement. There is no sharp point at which the body feels entirely released from demand, and without that release, recovery does not gather in the same way. Over time, this creates a perception that the body is slower to return, even when the underlying processes remain active. The body is working, but its work is distributed, layered across a field of continuous adjustment rather than focused within a defined interval. This distribution can also influence how the body responds to new demands. When a new strain or challenge appears, it is integrated into an already active system. The response may be effective, but it is shaped by the existing background, not initiated from a fully quiet state. This can make the recovery from that new demand feel less direct, as it unfolds alongside other ongoing processes rather than standing apart from them. When you consider this alongside earlier shifts in environment, movement, nourishment, and rhythm, the pattern becomes more complete. The body is not isolated from its conditions. It reflects them. In a world where signals persist, where demands are extended and less clearly defined, the body adapts by maintaining a steady level of engagement. Recovery, within that adaptation, becomes part of a continuous process rather than a separate phase. It is always present, always in motion, but rarely concentrated into a single recognizable period. This does not mean that the body has lost its capacity to restore itself. It means that the structure of restoration has changed. It unfolds across time, intertwined with ongoing activity, shaped by a context that no longer provides the same clear divisions between strain and rest. And within that structure, the sense of slower recovery emerges, not as a failure, but as the natural expression of a body adapting to a world where the signals it responds to no longer begin and end as sharply as they once did. When many of these changes are placed together, a different picture of the body begins to appear, one that is less about a single cause and more about a quiet accumulation of shifts across time. The body you live in has not been shaped by one environment, but by many, layered over one another across long stretches of history. It carries patterns that emerged under cold conditions, under scarcity, under constant movement, and then patterns that adjusted to more stable climates, repeated tasks, consistent intake, and extended forms of demand. None of these layers fully replace the others. They remain, interacting, sometimes aligning, sometimes pulling in different directions. Recovery, as part of this system, reflects that complexity. It is not governed by a single rule or a fixed speed. It is influenced by how these layers meet within the conditions of the present. The deeper origin of the human body suggests that it was once organized around urgency, where restoring function quickly could shape survival in immediate ways. Later conditions introduce stability, repetition, and predictability, allowing recovery to extend, to spread across time, and to integrate with other processes. These two tendencies do not cancel each other. They coexist. The body remains capable of rapid response when needed, but it also operates within patterns that allow for slower, more distributed repair. This coexistence creates a form of tension, not in the sense of conflict, but in the sense of multiple possibilities existing at once. At times, the body may respond quickly, returning strength or clarity in a short period. At other times, the same processes may unfold gradually, influenced by the broader context in which they are taking place. The variation can feel inconsistent, even confusing, because it does not follow a single predictable pattern. It reflects the fact that the body is not adapted to one specific environment, but to a range of them. When you consider the earlier shifts in movement, nourishment, rhythm, and ongoing demand, this layered structure becomes more visible. Each change does not act alone. They combine, shaping how the body allocates its resources, how it responds to signals, and how it moves through recovery. The result is not a simple slowing, but a redistribution. The work of repair is still being done, but it is spread across different times, influenced by multiple factors that may not align perfectly with one another. This can create a sense that recovery is incomplete or extended, not because the body is incapable, but because it is balancing many processes at once. The environment no longer provides a single dominant pressure that organizes all responses. Instead, it offers a mix of conditions, some that call for urgency, others that allow for delay. The body adapts by remaining flexible, capable of shifting between these modes, but not always doing so in a way that feels clear or immediate. Over time, this flexibility becomes part of the baseline experience. The body does not move through recovery in a single, unified way. It adjusts, recalibrates, and redistributes its efforts according to the signals it receives. This makes recovery appear slower, more gradual, and sometimes less complete, even as the underlying systems continue to function. What you are experiencing then may not be a loss of ability, but the expression of a body that carries multiple histories within it, responding to a present that no longer resembles any single one of those histories completely. When these layers begin to act together, the body does not simply choose one pattern over another. It blends them, sometimes smoothly, sometimes unevenly, depending on the situation. A moment of sudden demand can still bring forward older responses, where the body organizes itself quickly, directing energy toward immediate function. At other times, in the absence of urgency, the body allows its processes to spread out, following a slower and more distributed rhythm. This blending does not happen in a fixed sequence. It shifts according to context, influenced by movement, nourishment, rest, and the subtle signals that continue in the background. As a result, recovery does not follow a single path. It can change from one situation to another, even within the same person. The deeper origin of the human body supports this flexibility. Over long periods, it is adapted not to one stable condition but to variation itself. It carries the capacity to respond quickly when necessary, and to sustain longer processes when conditions allow. What has changed is not this capacity, but the balance between these modes. In earlier environments, urgency may have dominated more often, pulling recovery toward faster, more concentrated phases. In many present conditions, that urgency appears less frequently, and the body spends more time in modes that allow for gradual adjustment. This shift in balance can make recovery feel slower overall, even though the underlying systems remain intact. The body is still capable of rapid repair, but it is not always called upon to use that capacity. Instead, it operates within a broader range, where slower processes are given more space. This creates variability in how recovery is experienced. Some aspects may resolve quickly, while others extend over longer periods. The experience can feel uneven, not because the body is inconsistent in a simple sense, but because it is responding to multiple layers of influence at once. Each layer contributes to the overall pattern, shaping how resources are allocated and how processes unfold over time. When you notice that recovery does not match a single expectation, that it sometimes feels faster and at other times slower, this variation may reflect the interaction of these layers. The body is not moving away from its original design. It is expressing that design in a context that is more complex and less uniform than the environments in which it first developed. The result is a form of recovery that is adaptable, but also less predictable. It does not conform to a single rhythm because it is not governed by a single set of conditions. Instead, it adjusts continuously, integrating signals from the present with patterns shaped in the past. This integration can extend the timeline of recovery, not by reducing the body's ability to repair, but by distributing that repair across different modes of operation. The body is still working, still restoring balance, but it is doing so within a system that allows for multiple approaches at once. This multiplicity can make the process feel slower, more gradual, and less clearly defined, even as it continues to move forward. Over time, this becomes the normal experience, not because it is fixed, but because it reflects the way the body has learned to function across a wide range of conditions, carrying its history into a present that no longer fits neatly into any single pattern. As these different modes continue to operate together, the body begins to rely less on a single definition of recovery and more on a range of acceptable states. In earlier conditions, the boundary between being able to continue and being unable to continue was often clear. The body needed to reach a certain level of function to remain engaged with its environment, and recovery was closely tied to crossing that threshold. In a more varied and buffered setting, that boundary becomes less fixed. The body can function across a wider spectrum of states, some closer to full strength, others still in the process of returning. This expanded range changes how recovery is recognized. It is no longer a simple movement from one point to another, but a gradual shift within a broader field of possibilities. The deeper origin of this pattern lies in the body's ability to adapt to different levels of demand. It can operate under pressure when necessary, but it can also sustain itself under less intense conditions without requiring immediate completion of all internal processes. As the environment allows for more flexibility, the body uses that flexibility. It does not need to reach a single defined endpoint before resuming activity. It can continue within partial states, adjusting as it goes. This adjustment influences the perception of recovery. Without a clear endpoint, the process can feel extended. Improvement may be present, but it does not always arrive in a way that feels complete. Instead, it blends into ongoing activity, becoming part of a continuous cycle rather than a distinct phase that begins and ends. This blending can make it difficult to identify when recovery is finished, because the body is always operating within a range rather than at a fixed point. When you consider the layers of environment, movement, nourishment, rhythm, and ongoing demand, this pattern becomes more understandable. Each layer contributes to a system that favors flexibility over precision, continuity over separation. Recovery, within this system, is not lost. It is distributed. It unfolds across different conditions, responding to multiple signals at once. The body remains capable of returning to balance, but it does so without always marking that return with a clear transition. Over time, this creates a different expectation. Instead of waiting for a moment when the body feels fully restored, the experience becomes one of gradual adjustment, where function improves while activity continues. This does not indicate that the body is failing to complete its work. It reflects the way that work is now organized, spread across time and integrated with other processes. The sense of slower recovery, then, may arise not from a reduction in capacity, but from the absence of a single, clear endpoint. The body is still moving toward balance, but it does so within a system that allows for many intermediate states, each of which can sustain activity. This makes recovery less visible, less defined, and more continuous. And within that continuity, the body expresses a form of adaptation that carries both its past and its present, blending them into a pattern that no longer fits a simple definition of fast or slow, but instead reflects the broader range of conditions in which it now lives and recovers. If the body now moves within a wider range of states, where recovery does not arrive as a single, clearly defined moment, then the question itself begins to shift. It is no longer only about why recovery feels slower, but about how we have come to expect it to feel a certain way. The sense that the body should return quickly, cleanly, and completely may not come from the body alone. It may come from the way the present is organized, from the idea that processes should have clear beginnings and endings, that effort should lead to a visible result, and that restoration should follow a predictable path. When the body does not follow that path, the difference becomes noticeable. It feels like delay, like something is not working as it should. But when placed against the longer history of human adaptation, that expectation begins to look less certain. The deeper origin of the body suggests that recovery was not always experienced as a distinct phase that could be easily recognized. It was part of an ongoing interaction with the environment, with movement, with energy, and with changing conditions. It unfolded alongside life, not apart from it. In that context, the idea of a complete return to a prior state may not have been the most relevant measure. What mattered was the ability to continue, to adjust, to remain within the flow of activity even while change was still underway. When the environment changes and allows for more separation between effort and rest, between strain and recovery, a new expectation can form. Recovery becomes something that should be completed before activity resumes. It becomes a phase with an end point, something that can be measured by the absence of discomfort or fatigue. This expectation is not without value. It reflects a world where the body can be protected, where time can be given to restoration. But it also introduces a contrast with older patterns, where recovery was less clearly bounded. When the body now operates within a system that blends these patterns, the expectation of a clear endpoint can make the process feel incomplete. The body may have reached a state that is sufficient for function, but not one that matches the expectation of full resolution. This difference creates a sense of slowness, not because the body is incapable of returning, but because the definition of return has changed. The body is still following a logic shaped by long periods of adaptation, where continuation and adjustment were central. The present, however, often frames recovery as a discrete event with a clear conclusion. When these two perspectives meet, the experience can feel misaligned. The body moves gradually, while expectation looks for a clear shift. This misalignment does not require a simple correction. It invites a different way of observing what recovery is. Instead of asking when it will be finished, it may be possible to notice how it is unfolding, how the body is adjusting within the range of states it can sustain. This does not mean ignoring discomfort or accepting limitation without question. It means recognizing that the body's timing is shaped by a broader context than a single moment of strain. When you notice that recovery feels extended, that it does not arrive all at once, it may reflect this wider structure. The body is not only repairing a specific issue, it is balancing multiple processes, integrating signals, and adapting to conditions that no longer match a single, simple pattern. The sense of slowness, then, may not be a failure, but a sign of that complexity. A sign that recovery is not a single point to be reached, but a process that continues as long as the body continues to move, to respond, and to adjust within the world it inhabits. If the feeling of slow recovery is shaped partly by expectation, then the body begins to look less like a machine that has fallen behind, and more like a living system still answering to older conditions in a newer world. The present often teaches us to think in clean sequences. A problem appears, the problem is addressed, the problem ends. This structure is useful in many parts of life, but the body does not always follow it. A bruise fades in uneven shades. Strength returns in steps, not all at once. A night of rest helps, but does not fully erase what came before. A minor strain seems gone, then quietly reappears under the same familiar movement. These experiences can feel disappointing because they do not match a neat idea of repair. Yet across most of human history, the body was not shaped in a world organized around neat completion. It was shaped in a world where survival often depended on continuing before restoration was finished, where repair had to overlap with movement, weather, hunger, and uncertainty. In that older setting, recovery may have been understood less as a return to a perfect earlier state, and more as a gradual restoration of enough function to remain engaged with life. That does not make the process lesser. It only makes it different. The deeper human story suggests that the body has long been capable of operating within partial states, carrying fatigue while moving, carrying strain while adapting, carrying incompleteness without collapsing into failure. That capacity still exists now. It can be felt whenever the body continues despite not being fully restored. But in the present, where there is often more space between effort and danger, that same gradualness can be interpreted as a problem rather than a pattern. The body may already be doing what it has long done, returning in layers, but the mind now looks for a sharper line between damaged and healed, tired and restored, limited and ready again. This is where the question becomes gentler and perhaps more interesting. Maybe the body has not simply become slow. Maybe the world around it has changed the meaning of what slow feels like. In a harsher environment, a small improvement could matter immediately. The return of enough strength to walk, enough balance to stand, enough clarity to keep moving would have been meaningful recovery, even if deeper restoration continued quietly afterward. In the present, those smaller returns can be overlooked because they do not satisfy the expectation of complete resolution. The body may already have crossed the threshold that once mattered most, but because life now allows us to notice the unfinished layers more clearly, recovery can feel delayed. This does not mean the unfinished layers are unimportant. They are real, and they shape how the body feels. But it suggests that the experience of slowness may come not only from biology, but from contrast between how the body actually restores itself and how we imagine restoration should appear. When placed against the long arc from the Ice Age to now, the human body begins to look like a compromise that never stopped being revised. It carries systems built for urgency, but lives in conditions that often allow postponement. It carries the ability to recover while moving, but often finds itself in worlds that separate effort from repair. It carries rhythms formed under darkness, variation, and direct environmental pressure, yet now lives among schedules, repetition, and softer but more continuous demands. In such a body, recovery would almost have to feel uneven, not broken, not absent, but layered, stretched, and difficult to summarize in a single moment of return. And if that is true, then perhaps the most honest way to approach the question is not to ask why the body fails to recover as quickly as we wish, but whether the body is still following an older logic of return, one that values continuation, adjustment, and sufficient balance before complete resolution. If so, then what feels like slowness may also be a trace of history, a quiet sign that the body still belongs, in part, to a world where recovery was never a separate chapter, only a process folded into the unfinished work of staying alive. If the body has been moving through all of these shifts without ever fully leaving behind its earlier patterns, then the final question becomes quieter, less about finding a single explanation and more about noticing what remains consistent beneath the changes. Across cold and warmth, movement and stillness, scarcity and stability, the body has continued to do the same essential work. It responds, it adjusts, it restores what it can, when it can, within the conditions it is given. The pace of that restoration has never been fixed. It has always depended on what the body must do at the same time, on what the environment requires, and on how much space exists between one demand and the next. In earlier conditions, that space was often narrow. Recovery had to fit into brief openings, shaped by urgency and necessity. In the present, that space has widened, but it has also become more complex, filled with different kinds of signals that do not always resolve cleanly. The body moves within this wider space in a way that reflects both its past and its present. It still carries the ability to return quickly when needed, but it also expresses a slower, more distributed form of recovery when urgency fades. These two tendencies do not cancel each other. They create a pattern that is layered, sometimes uneven, and often difficult to define with a single measure. When you feel that the body is taking longer to recover, that it does not return in a clear or complete way, it may be tempting to see that as a loss, as something that has diminished over time. But there is another way to view it, one that does not require the body to be better or worse, only different. The body may be doing what it has always done, adjusting its timing to match the conditions around it. In a world that no longer demands immediate readiness at every moment, it can allow recovery to unfold more gradually. In a body that carries multiple layers of adaptation, that gradualness can appear as inconsistency, as a lack of clear resolution, even when the underlying processes are active and continuous. This perspective does not remove the experience of fatigue or the discomfort of lingering strain. Those experiences remain real, and they matter, but it shifts how they are understood. Instead of being signs that the body is failing to keep up, they can be seen as part of a longer process, one that does not separate living from recovering, but blends them together. The body does not step out of life to repair itself and then return fully restored. It repairs itself within life, within movement, within ongoing demands that never fully disappear. This has likely always been true, but it becomes more visible now because the conditions around the body have changed. The contrast makes the process easier to notice, and perhaps easier to question, and so the question that began this exploration remains, but in a slightly different form. Not only why the body seems to recover more slowly after the Ice Age, but what it means for recovery to be measured in a world that is no longer defined by the same pressures that shaped it. If the body still carries an older rhythm, one built for urgency, and now lives in a setting that allows for delay, then the feeling of slowness may be less about a loss of ability and more about a shift in timing. A shift that has unfolded gradually, across environments and generations, leaving behind a body that is still capable of restoring itself, but does so in a way that reflects the longer history it carries. And if that is the case, then perhaps recovery is not something that has become slower, but something that has become harder to recognize, because it no longer arrives as a single clear moment, but as a continuous process, moving quietly through the background of everyday life, asking not to be measured only by how quickly it ends, but by how steadily it allows the body to continue.